Yeah,
when she
she
can.
sent a notice saying that she'll be late. Yeah.
Yeah. So we could go ahead and start this. What we've been doing here for a while, the last couple of sessions in Mythos, in our Mythos and Logos series, is looking at sort of the capsule treatment that we have to put together for this book to introduce people, to give them a ramp up to get started with these kind of Smith ideas so that they know how to read these essays. Because as we're all discovering, you read it the first time and it's a totally different experience than after you've had some time to talk about it and think about it. You come back to the same essay and it's totally different. The words all jump out at you differently and they make a different whole with a different meaning. So we thought, why not some endnotes? Why not some introductions? And, you know, clue people in a little bit about where the big traps are that they should watch out for. And in this kind of layout I did here in the text, we've really been looking at 5 and 6, right? We're trying to talk about these basal human faculties and what is the third faculty that is also available to us, but that we have to grow into and struggle for. And the reason that we talk about that is because in Kenneth Smith's schema for describing people, we fall into character types based on the relationships between where do we see the source of truth coming from in our lives? Where do we see the source of meaning? How do we make ethical decisions? And instead of there being an infinite variety of possibilities, they tend to cluster. The infinite variety tends to orbit a couple of different places. So there's sort of the dualic mode of life, which orbits begriff, which orbits the immersive, concrete, immediate experience of life, strong on sensation, strong on feeling, strong on what I have gone through. And then there is the Verstand mode of life that we develop in ourselves, which is the ability to abstract out of that immersive experience and to be more intellectual and planning and controlling and schematized. And everybody's got both of these faculties, right? But the question is, who's master? You know what? Which faculty is made subservient to the other one? Which one is treated as a toolkit and assistance for the other one? Which one is master of the other? And if you're dualic, you have the experiential feeling mode dominant, and everything that you learn to do as of in the Verstand side of your mind, you use to serve your begriff desires, your begriff priorities and meaning and choices. But if you're Banausic, you do it the other way around. You put all your value into the abstracting, scientizing, intellectualizing, logicizing side of the mind, and you try to make all your feelings and experiences subservient to your ideas and systems. And this is what part 5 in that schema I put in the chat was about. These are the two basal human faculties that we're all born with, and we all develop, especially in modernism, we both developed them a lot, but one or the other is the horse that's leading the cart. And it really changes your outlook on life. It changes how you interpret what's real, what's good, and so forth. And so the challenge that we had, and we spent all of the seminar last week setting up to be able to talk about this week. The challenge is there is a third potential mental faculty we are also born with. But under modernism, it's stunted. It's underdeveloped, and it's not underdeveloped by accident. It's underdeveloped the way underdeveloped nations have been underdeveloped by colonial powers. That is, it's been stomped on and neutered, and the legs have been cut out from under it, and everything has been done possible to try to keep it from developing in people, because that third faculty in us is more revolutionary and has a tendency to destabilize power systems. And modernism is a very systematized approach to life. And the last thing in the world that it wants is for a bunch of people engaging in Vernunft and, starting a revolution. It's like they want to keep it static. They don't want people questioning the meaning of things or the truth of things. They want people to fit within the schema of the system and to accept it as it is, and to find roles for themselves that allow them to contribute to the system without seriously destabilizing it. No matter whether the system is good or bad, true or false, no matter what its merits might be, the system does not want to be questioned. And that in itself is a very Verstand thing for the system to do. If the system were based on Vernunft, the system would want to be questioned. The system would demand to be questioned. It would be constantly looking for its own flaws and trying to improve itself and grow. But since it's based on Verstand, it's based on a static approach to life, on ontology, on being instead of becoming. So for us to understand what this third mode is very difficult, even though we're born with the capacity. Our education, our acculturation, everything about our lives has been as moderns has been designed to make it invisible to us, to make it something that's not possible, to try to reduce the mind down to just the two faculties and to pretend that the third one doesn't exist. And to pretend it doesn't exist so profoundly that it doesn't even say it doesn't exist. It's just the terms and definitions and the way we think about the world seems to exclude the possibility of anything other than one of these two basal modes of the mind. It doesn't seem to be any reason to even ask the question, could there be a third mode, and are we suppressing it? The two modes each present a picture of the world in which they seem to be complete unto themselves. Even though they acknowledge the existence of the other, they don't allow that there might be anything beyond this binary dual system. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I look at it slightly differently, but coming from a different, to the same point of view.
Excellent.
It's just a couple of days ago, I was in a meeting, I think called The Rise of Hatred, from the Bay Area Humanities meetup group. And they brought up an issue. And this guy says, like, he talked about racism light. Okay, and he tried to distinguish racism light to racism, I guess, heavy or deep. Okay. And so I said that we are in an inflection moment because racist light is actually in some ways more dangerous than racist deep.
Yes. Because
each of us has the capacity to a certain degree to care for others to a certain degree. And what racism light does is to so normalize the system and the structures that it becomes invisible to us. I mean, to maybe not all of us, but a lot of us. And so we would always deny that we're racist because as everything is normal the way it is, and they don't understand that the institutional structure has created a systemic racism that is somehow invisible. I mentioned about this American Indian filmmaker, who said when he was little, they always played cowboys and Indians, but everybody wanted to be a cowboy, which means that even it became normalized in that sense.
Right.
And I said, we're in an inflection moment because finally it's been uncovered, at least somewhat, so we could recognize it. And of course, the other side, I guess the racism deep people, are trying to cover it over. So if we don't take advantage of this moment where people are finally have to confront that there is a racism light that was invisible, then it will be covered over soon, and we will get back to the norm that we are all used to. And so this is a very, very important moment. I don't know how long it'll last, but if something doesn't happen because the other side is trying very hard and now they have to go through actually lies rather than the structure to, in a sense, repair the system itself. So in that sense, I guess I arrive at the third point, but I guess I have slightly different language for the same thing. And it's that we have to take advantage of this moment in some way to maybe not to uncover it for ourselves, who may understand this problem, but uncover it for those others who are not racist or deep people, but they are nonetheless racist. And so they could see and become self-critical, because the first thing you need to know is that you have to be able to see the thing before you can think about the thing.
Yes.
If you don't see it, then you can't think about it, because it's just everything is normal. Like, what is it do you want? That sort of thing. Okay.
Well, it's good to have more language to talk about this. It's good to have multiple perspectives. That's like Kenneth Smith's, fundamental idea on these things, is that we need multiple perspectives. And particularly with issues like this, where modernism makes them so hard to talk about clearly. Our words and thoughts are all tangled up in ways that it's very hard to say the things that most need to be said. So neither Kenneth nor I nor David nor any of his past students are going to be able to really clearly, directly say the things that need to be said. We need to all be coming at this from different angles and figuring out, how do you even talk about this? How do you express it? That's why I'm drawing my little doodles and pictures that I'll be bringing forward in these. I've got some for this week too. I've got one I've been working on, just trying to find a way to visualize it. So I'm glad you said that, Phil. Hi, Joseph. So yeah, so our challenge this week is to see, can we go past where I left off last week, where we had really talked about the trap of the two basal human mentalities and how they lock each other into a relationship such that they seem to exclude anything else, like the positive and negative poles of a magnet seem to suggest the whole world can be explained as magnetism. Everything is either one or the other. And therefore, what need do you have for, electricity or gravity or any of those other complicated, forces of the universe? They're unnecessary, right? It's all magnetism. This is the worldview kind of put forth by the two basal human faculties. Naturally, they tend to want to say that they can explain it all. So we set that all up last week, and that sets us up this week to really dive into. So what if you're not taking your source of truth and meaning and ethics from your begriff, from your feelings and your sensations and your perceptions and your experience of life, and if you're not taking it from your thoughts and your systems and your learned codes, then where are you supposed to take it from? Because that would seem to be everything. Right. This is why there doesn't seem to be room for a third mental faculty from the perspective of these two. They seem to have covered all the bases. It's either how you feel about things and experience them, or it's how you think about things and how you've learned them. It's got to be one or the other, right? So I'm going to crack that egg now, and we'll do it with some pictures. And I'm going to start here. Let's see. I should share my desktop. So let me share screen. Ta-da. So let's begin with a metaphor that we have in the modern age for left brain and right brain. We've all heard the left brain and right brain thing, right? And if you've done any analysis at all into neurophysiology, neuroanatomy, they'll tell you this isn't strictly right. That there is division of function according to the hemispheres of the brain, and that sometimes in some ways it kind of lines up with this, but in many ways it doesn't. And that this isn't the literal truth. This is a metaphor. But if you just erase left brain and right brain, and you put in Begriff and Verstand, right? The other way around, left brain being Verstand, right brain being Begriff. If we assume that this isn't about brain anatomy, but that this is about brain function, and that the brain can function in these two different ways, then even though we're not exactly lined up with what the Greeks and Hegel and Kierkegaard and Kenneth Smith see, we're sort of starting to sniff around the right neighborhood, right? This idea that the analytical, abstractive, noetic functions of Verstand create a linearized world, an analyzed, linearized, divided into pieces, diagrammatized world, right? And it does that because it's useful. The whole point of Verstand is to get control, to have power. And we get power by abstracting ourselves and picking out the details that we think give us buttons and leverage on reality and on ourselves. And we focus on those. They become the foreground of our thought. And we suppress into the background everything that doesn't seem to have pragmatic value, that doesn't seem to have use value. And this is how a Verstand perspective on a tree looks at the tree and sees lumber, or sees a decoration for the yard with a certain amount of value, or sees money, or it might measure the height. But they're all abstractions. They certainly don't engage with the tree as the totality of a tree by any means. And it's not even most of the tree. It's only strictly the parts that it deems useful. Whereas a begriff experience of the tree is all full of, the green and the brown and the roughness and the softness and the birds that fly into it and the way it changes through the season. All this experiential as well as emotional and sensory stuff is present with begriff. But of course, the problem with begriff is it's only present if you physically are present or ever were physically present with it, right? It's an immediate, localized concreteness. Whereas noesis gives us a universalizing power, but at the cost of abstracting away all the details. All the juice of life is left behind when someone leaves begriff and goes to Verstand. The reason why we want to live, the taste of the food, our love for our family, the delight of a sound of music, all the good stuff is left behind in begriff. And in Verstand, we're left with all this control, but evacuated of meaning, right? It becomes a nihilized world in which I can do whatever I want as long as I have the power to do it, as long as I've analyzed the situation correctly and built the right tools, I can do the thing. Whether it's a good thing to do and whether I even care and whether, life is worth living if I focus my life around this is one of the huge problems that a Verstand-oriented life has. It's all the juice is gone. So this split, it sort of abstracts some of this. It's not exactly right. This isn't exactly a left brain, right brain thing. And it isn't exactly the things that people mean when they say left brain and the things they mean when they say right brain. But you will find places where Kenneth Smith uses left brain and right brain as an analogy for the noetic versus the gnosic, for the Verstand versus the begriff. So I'm going to just take 5 minutes and give you guys some neuroanatomy and neurophysiology, because central to Kenneth Smith's argument as an existentialist philosopher is that what he's talking about is not escapist. It's not a schema, even though I said the word schema earlier today in this call. It's not a schema that he's imposing. He's not noetically, analytically saying, I think that people should fall into these categories because it makes my philosophical system work correctly. He's not doing what Kant did when Kant said we should throw out all traditional sources of value and we should just rationally decide, thereby implying that all people had the same kind of mind that was capable of making those decisions, right? There's an abstraction, there's an imposition of an abstraction on reality in Kantian conceptions of all human beings being capable of rationally deciding right and wrong that Kenneth Smith really doesn't want to do. So I'm now going to take 5 minutes to just sort of sketch out why what Kenneth's doing with Verstand and begriff is not, in fact, a Kantian abstraction. And we'll begin, you guys will, some of you may know all of this, some of you might not know much of it, but all of you will know some of it. So let's start with the lobes of the cerebral cortex, right? When we look at the gross anatomy of the brain, you can see it's got two hemispheres, but they're linked together through a corpus callosum in the middle. And when you look a little closer, you can see that each hemisphere is broken up into lobes. It's like a parent. It's visible on the surface. Some of the boundaries are a little less clear than others, but for example, the central sulcus that separates the frontal lobe from the other lobes is pretty apparent. And even more apparent is the temporal lobe, which sort of sticks out here. You can see the actual shape of it when you look at a brain. And you can also see how the cerebrum as a whole is separated from the cerebellum and the brainstem. It's apparent on the surface that these have grown into separate regions of the brain, even though they're all connected. And we have our ideas about what the lobes tend to do more or less, but all these ideas are based on the fact we still don't really understand exactly how the brain works. And so our attempts to pin down, well, this lobe does this and that lobe does that, they're all a little, right? Even the most rigorous scientific analysis of the brain still has an awful lot of it's like when you take somebody who specializes in information science and get them to try to define intelligence for you. Oh, you do artificial intelligence? That's great. Define intelligence. And you'll quickly find that it breaks down. We're working in murky areas we don't really understand. But we can look at the brain itself. So we've got 2 hemispheres, we've got 4 lobes to the cerebrum. But more importantly, we have layers. Oh, you can't see them from the outside, but they're so much more important. We can say left brain and right brain is where we get these huge distinction between emotional creativity and analytical intellectualism. But that's not true at all. Because when you look at the anatomy of the brain, it's so much clearer that it's in the white matter at the center that you get a lot of the emotional switching stations. And where our ability to sense the world, the organs of the brain that are most involved in processing sensations are right next to the organs of the brain that process emotions. They're hooked up very tightly together. We have emotional reactions very quickly to the input that we bring in. Before we can even think about it, we're already reacting emotionally. And all of those things are tied up very close to the brainstem and the cerebellum, which are busy keeping our whole body operating at all. So our basic ability to raise and lower our blood pressure, to raise and lower our heartbeat, every system that's caught up in a Heraclitean balance of forces that are trying to keep it within a living range. Those things aren't just allowed to do their job, but they are hooked directly up to our sensation and emotion centers so that our sensations and emotions can modify all of the basic controls for our life. So we can get amped up when it's time to get amped up, and we can relax when it's not time to get amped up. There is a direct relationship between our physiological reactions and our processing of emotion and sensations. And so what we find is, it's not illustrated here, but if we were to trace all the nerves out of the nose, out of the tongue, out of the eyes, out of all the sensory areas, they bypass the cortex and go right into these sensory emotional centers first before we get to rationally start thinking about things. This is very important. This is the architecture of the brain. And when we look at less evolutionarily derived species that are preserving to the present day earlier structures, earlier states of the brain. I mean, they're not in a time machine, right? They're modern creatures, but that have not evolved, for example, a prefrontal cortex, or that have a much thinner, smaller cerebral cortex. What we find is that they still have a lot of power right here in the center. This stuff is very old. The need to be able to process emotions and attach them to sensations quickly, and to attach that to brain physiology goes way back in evolution. We've been doing it a long time, long before we've been thinking about the world. And that's important to understand. The other thing to understand is that by using different kinds of stains or by diving in and looking very closely under a microscope, or preferably both, what you discover is that there are cortical layers even to the cerebrum itself. It is not one big spongy mass. The neurons are organized into groups, different kinds of neurons predominating at different layers of the brain, from down here in the white matter to out here onto the surface of the cortex. There is a shell structure to the cerebrum, many layers of neurons. And that shell structure is linked by neurons that go from the outside to the inside. So during brain surgery, you open up somebody's brain and you use a probe to send a light electrical signal to stimulate any part of the cerebrum you want. And what you will find is that that neuron will link down to the emotional centers of the brain. There is no thought that you can have anywhere in the intellectualizing parts of your brain that does not connect to the emotional parts of your brain. And as we mentioned before, the emotional parts also connect to the sensory parts and to the physiology parts, to the beating of the heart and so forth. So everything is built around your emotions. Every thought you have is built around your emotions. Every memory you have is built around your emotions. The whole schema is an emotional engine. That's not how we talk about it. We talk about it right in the modern world like it's a machine, and it processes data, and it has facts, and the facts are in storage locations, right? And we say these things because that's how computers work, but that's not how the brain works at all. Not even a little bit. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, as you were talking about this, I can't help but think about the rose-colored glasses.
Yeah.
As far as I'm concerned, I already know that there is a pair of rose-colored glasses in our senses because
Yes.
it does not translate reality as we do it.
Yes.
So you're saying that there's another second pair of rose-colored glasses that must filter through the emotion before we even get to our intellect.
That's
So
right.
therefore, by the time we get to intellect, we're wearing two sunglasses.
Yes.
So
Yes.
the man in the cave that climbed out of the cave to see the sun,
Yes.
he did not see the sun. He saw the residue of the cave looking at the sun.
That's what he
So
saw.
that's what you're saying, right?
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
So, I have a different, when you had the first diagram, I had a different picture. And no, this one, yeah. And what I did was, there was a time when I did diptychs.
Ah, nice.
The reason why I did diptychs, in my case, is not like the religious diptychs. What I did when I started drawing in nature, we going to it was a short period, but I did that. And then I looked at it and I said, like, what if I, on the other side, did a kind of abstract picture? Okay, and then I started doing, my anti-paintings in one sense, but which I had two sides. I was like East Coast, West Coast, let's say New York, California, the grit versus the feeling and so
Yes.
forth. And people used to say, like, well, which part of the picture are you most involved with? I say, it's really the crack that's in the middle. Really,
Yeah.
the crack in the middle, because both sides lead to the middle that you have to, in a sense, negotiate between the two. And that actually leads to my thing about living in the city walls.
Yes.
In that sense, right? So in a sense, you have to be able to equivocate. And I said that if you have to find a focal point, then you would say it's right in that crack.
Yes.
Right in the middle.
Right in the corpus callosum.
That actually is the point of the picture, not really as the modernist, although I consider myself a modernist in terms of art, not really where the modernist is like as a rebellion against traditional art in which from the center out, but actually the whole thing is a kind of democratic process with the distribution. I said it's really the crack that's in between that play off both sides. That's the thing. So in that sense, I enjoy you explaining about the second pair of rose-colored glasses.
Yes.
Which, well, maybe I knew, but I wasn't so conscious of until you explained it, that it filters through this other thing. So we are judging, in a sense, reality through a sensation and then our emotions, and then we have it. And that's why you have scientists, even who supposedly critical scientists, already leaning in one side or the other, in a sense.
Yes. Yes, that's right. So we're still, trying to understand what all this works. One of the things to understand is that our understanding of the number of cortical layers there are in the cerebrum has changed, but it hasn't changed a lot. If you go back to Gray's Anatomy, the classic textbook from late 19th, early 20th century, you're going to find 5 cortical layers to the cerebrum. They already knew. They already could stain them and see the different, you can see it under a microscope with the right stains. Now we've got more like 6. And if you count the white matter at the center of the brain where all the emotional processing happens, maybe it's 7, right? But here's what's important about this. So these pyramidal neurons are organized in such a way that when you touch one, when you stimulate it, it wants to send the signal out to every, to all of the other neurons that it connects to, right? It's got all this branching so that the signal that strikes it up here can travel down and travel out all of these different routes. And at each one of those, at the endpoints of each one of these, is a synapse that's made up of other neurons reaching in right to that gap and forming a little community of neurons that all want to know when a signal comes there. And so when the signal comes out to the end of the neuron here and it sends out the neurotransmitter into the synapse, a whole mess of other neurons receive that signal and transmit it all over the place. This is not a linear process. This is massively associational. If you could see it under a CT scan or PET scan or MRI or whatever you could use to visualize the activity of the brain, what you'd see is that when you stimulate the top, the surface, at one point, the neuron lights up all the other neurons that it touches, and they light up all the other neurons they touch, and you get this kind of like massive, complex Gordian knot-like lightning structure that flashes out into the brain. And when it does that, it's not a random process. It doesn't like flash everywhere all at once. It flashes in 3 directions. It flashes from outside to in because it's in the white matter that we get the emotional juice that gives that stimulus meaning. It flashes from one side to the other. If you stimulate the temporal lobe right here on the left side, that will transmit through the corpus callosum to the temporal lobe on the opposite side at the same location. So there is a horizontal side-to-side stimulation that happens. The 2 hemispheres talk to each other, and that's part of how they talk. If one has an idea, the other is comparing or contrasting immediately to it. And it will also stimulate front to back. Along the surface, the neurons run horizontally. And so if you stimulate the prefrontal cortex up here, it's also going to stimulate the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. They're all going to get involved in this thought, whatever this thought is. Both hemispheres get involved, all 4 lobes on each side get involved, and all the cortical layers, including the white matter at the center, get involved. And because the white matter is connected to your physiology, it means your body gets involved. This is a massively connected system, 3 dimensions of connectivity. So if we were going to try to model this, which we colloquially in pop culture call left brain versus right brain, and think of it as Begriff versus Verstand, and we were going to try to center it in actual neuroanatomy, we'd say that the Begriff activity is an activity in which we give precedence to the white matter, because the white matter reaches everything through all the pyramidal neurons and through the lateral neurons across the surface. Every time you feel something, if you're angry or if you're sad or if you're curious, it's going to light up all over the brain. Ideas are going to be lit up by that. You with me so far? So there is an organizational schema of the brain in which everything can be reached from the emotional experiential centers. That's Begriff. Begriff is the entire contents of everything that you think and feel and know and remember, organized according to your experiences, according to your emotions, your sensations, and your memories. See the hippocampus right in here, memory. Right by the amygdala, emotion. They're all tied together in a nexus. This is one schema of the mind, one of 3 schemas of the mind, and they're built right into the biology. You can see them. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I apologize for cutting in.
It's quite all right.
So often because this is very exciting. As you were talking, I was thinking about AlphaGo again, and I'll explain what I mean.
Yeah.
AlphaGo, of course, is much better in computation than our mind is, okay? And they play 5 games. And of course, AlphaGo won, was it 3? 3 games, okay?
4. I think it's 4 games.
No, 3 games. I'm going to the 4th.
Oh.
So 3 straight. And then what happened was, by all analysis, this Go champion won the 4th game because of what everybody called the God move. That was incomprehensibly creative, that it was unexpected, right? And in a funny way, the fifth game is the most important game to me in this sense. Normally, I think of thinking as having, analytical thinking as having two strategies. One is what we call strategical, which presume to look at the whole, and then lower down you have the tactical moves. AlphaGo, its computation are so fast that it could make tactical moves very nicely. Not that it couldn't make strategical moves as well. And so after, I think, AlphaGo realized that there was something beyond its comprehension. In other words, it was surprised and shocked. The fifth game was very interesting because halfway through, AlphaGo started making these very weird moves that just seems like kind of stupid. Like, what the hell's going on? And then toward the end of the game, they realized that it was making these tactical moves because the tactical advantage was to it. And it was just counting points, not winning the games, counting the points. So that in a sense, it won by 2 points or 1 point, it was very close. It won 2 points or 1 point because it forced the opposition to not be able to move the God move, the creative move, because it forced it to play the game it knew that it could win.
Yeah. Right.
So that was very interesting because it forced you to say, at some level, the tactics could be so advanced, there is no distinction between the tactics and the strategy, because the tactics itself could overpower the strategy because it is very powerful. And that taught me a lesson like, whoa, that there is something about it that in a sense, we could still be ahead of the computer because we could go outside the parameters of the game and make moves that is totally not within the rules of the game, but because it is a game, it's forcing you to play the game.
Right.
Which is interesting.
Yeah, so much of Go is about initiative and trying to steal the initiative from the opponent so that they can't make the move they want to make. They have to make the move they have to make because of what you did.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like that's what AlphaGo did there, is drag them out of that. So the last thing to say about the Begriff schema of the mind before I turn to the Verstand schema of the mind is this. One way to think about these three directions of connectivity, side to side, right between the hemispheres, front to back through the four lobes, and outside to inside through the cortical layers, is, now this is an abstraction, right? This is an oversimplification, but it gets you in the general neighborhood of the truth of how the brain works. Imagine the brain like a clock that pulses, and every pulse of the clock passes information through all three of those directions. The information is passed through the lobes front to back, it's passed through the hemispheres side to side, and it's passed through the layers from outside to inside. And doing all three of those things is one tick of the clock. It's one pulse. What's happening when that happens is all of the neurons are competing for who's got the juiciest emotions as a consequence of that idea. So is it in my memories? Is it in my sensations? Is it what I'm seeing right now? Is it in what I'm thinking about? Is it in how I'm evaluating it? The different functions of the brain are each trying to produce the most juice they can out of that pulse. And whoever has it wins. And what they found becomes the new information for the next pulse. And now the brain, through its 3 dimensions, through the next pulse, is all responding to that piece of information instead of the other things it could have been responding to. So there's a competition going on for who's got the juice. So no matter how rational it is, even if you talk to a mathematician, when they're going through a mathematical proof and considering different possible avenues, at some level, what they're doing is systematized and memorized. But underneath that, there's an emotional level in which they're getting a charge out of being able to produce a brilliant proof. And presented with 3 possible avenues for the next step in their proof, 2 that are interesting but dry and 1 that's exciting and surprising, they're almost always going to try the exciting, surprising one, because the brain is addicted to the juice. It wants that emotional charge that backs up the thought. And the thought with the most charge, or the sensation with the most charge, or the memory with the most charge, or the value judgment with the most charge wins, right? And the physiological connection down here, when we said, the brain stem and the cerebellum are so closely connected to emotion and memory and the rest, also means that your body itself gets to win, right? So if you burn your hand on the stove while you're thinking about philosophy, guess what happens? that charge is juicier than the other charges. And all of a sudden you forget about Kant and you're like, my hand, right? This is why you rip your hand off the stove. You pull it away because that charge wins. And whatever you were in the middle of has to wait until you're done with it. And when it ebbs enough and you're like, okay, I guess my hand's okay, then you're like, yeah, so what about Kant? You can go back to it then, but you can't do it at the moment when the charge is higher coming out of your body. So this is the model, the Begriff model of the brain.
I want to break in.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
So one of my dilemmas is finding that in Salem, Oregon, there is a church that had 75 COVID cases for Mother's Day. They decided to have a congregation. And I think what you're saying is a solution to understanding this is that they're basing their decisions on this emotional, juicy part of getting together and thinking about whatever they think about. And I could not understand it. So I think this explanation is helping me.
Yeah, you can't do the thing you don't have juice for, because other things have juice and you'll want to do them instead.
It's why so much propaganda appeals to the emotional centers of the brain, because that actually hijacks the logical processing. It goes straight past that. So that's why that's so effective. Sorry to interrupt there, Rick.
No, it's perfect. That's a perfect addition. And it's why Buddhism focuses, if you want to gain control of yourself, they focus on mindfulness. You want to try to create a calmer environment with less juice so that the quieter, juicy parts of the brain have a chance to participate in the conversation, so that they're not being trampled all the time by all the roaring and yelling. And, when Shakespeare says, a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury signifying nothing, that is one of the most important things Shakespeare ever said. He's talking about the problem we have in the human condition, where that we are tempted to be drawn to the big, exciting stuff, even when it's not the important stuff. And the temptation is at a physiological level all the way down to the roots of the brain. We kind of need to attend to the big, exciting thing. And that explains why one of the easiest ways to manipulate human beings is to get them excited. And it's why one of the best ways to get self-control is to try to create a quiet environment where you can insulate yourself from outside interference, so that at least some part of the day you can create the quietness that you need in order to hear within yourself the other important things that are going on that have been drowned out. So yes, the limbic system. Yes, good. That's good stuff. Okay, so 1 or 2 more things, and then we're done with this for Begriff, and then I'll lay down Verstand, and then we'll be ready to talk Vernunft. So here are some images taken from a Golgi stain, a Nissl stain, and a Weigert stain of the brain, showing the cortical layers. These are drawings taken from slides, and as you can see, if you step back and look at them, you realize these cortical layers are not just somebody's idea. the neurons change shape. Different kinds of neurons predominate at different layers of the brain. These layers are real. You can see them under, and now you're seeing them, right? Effectively, this is your brain, you know, a slice from outside to inside. So with that said, I include this just for completeness. You know, there's a lot of ways to diagram this out and try to show the way that signals are transmitted from outside to inside. And it goes the other direction too, right? Because remember, if I stimulate on the left side of the brain in my frontal lobe, it goes from outside to inside and down through the corpus callosum to the opposite hemisphere and comes out the other side back up into the frontal cortex in the same location, so that the signals go both directions, right? They go both directions. They go inside out and outside in. They go front to back and back to front. They go from left to right and from right to left. All right, so, you know, part of the reason to do this is to remind ourselves of the actual tangible reality of the brain, not as an abstraction like mind or soul or spirit, but as an actual organ of the body that has its actual own physiology. Right? So when we talk about the idea that there are different ways that the mind works, we mean there are different ways the brain works. There are different ways that the brain puts together information and tries to make decisions. And you can visualize this. My break will be in about 15 to 20 minutes, so I can go a little longer here before I take my 10-minute break for my kitty. So, in a begriff mode, we're driven entirely by what's down here. And what's out here is harnessed to serve what's down here. It is our experiences of life and our feelings and our sensations that call the shots, that are in charge. And we do thinking. We do abstract, you know, we engage in Verstand activities. You can't not do it. For a human being to not engage in Verstand, they wouldn't be able to walk. They wouldn't be able to process what they see. They wouldn't be able to talk. All these things that we do involve developing Verstand capabilities atop our begriff architecture. But when you're dualic, when you have a dualic mindset, what you're doing is letting begriff be the master. And all those other capabilities are merely serving it. Right? And it's got pros and cons as a mode of life. But to be Verstand is to say that you don't want that you don't like that. As Hegel says, it's about a negation, is to say I don't want to be subject to the downsides of that form of life. And so I'm going to start molding myself and changing my priorities. I'm going to try to create some calm and insulation. Like, say, if I grew up in a crazy family and every time we get together they're always yelling and laughing and, you know, there's just wild emotional roller coaster. If I want to be a Verstand person, I'm almost certainly going to spend less time with my family, right? Because it's hard to concentrate and it's hard to think. It's hard to focus and get control when I'm going through that roller coaster. And I might still visit them sometimes, but less often. And I might have more quiet times where I can decide for myself what it is that I want to do and who I want to be. And I start making more choices up here when all this has been calmed down. And these choices I make up here, I start organizing according to my thoughts more than I'm organizing according to my emotions, part of the time. Now, as we know from what I said before, your emotions are still in there. They're still juicy, but you're drawing off of a quieter set while the louder set is sleeping, if you will. And it gives you the ability to start, for example, you could start getting some pride in your ability to do math, or pride in your ability to do logic or programming, or pride in your mastery of an area of the law that you're now going to become a lawyer. Or so on. Pride as an economist, pride in being able to run Microsoft Excel, pride in, you start to develop this investment, emotional investment in your development of this side of your life that wasn't immediately juicy and rewarding, but it's becoming juicier the more you do it because you've got value judgments, you're investing in it. You know what I mean? And so really nerdy kids get really excited about things that other kids don't understand. Why do you even care about that, right? Well, it's hard for me to explain why I care about that because I don't know how my own brain works. But I am, whether I'm crazy about, collectible trading cards, or whether I'm crazy about putting models together, or whatever the thing is that I'm doing that's abstracted from the juice of life, that I'm now investing myself emotionally into and building a personality for myself out of. That stuff now has emotional meaning for me that it doesn't for other people. And that emotional scaffolding lets me develop that intellectualized, systematized part of my life. And so I begin to reorganize my brain based on my decisions about the brain. And so instead of an inside out mode of organization in which every neuron is connected to the white matter, which is still there, I start to obsess over a more lateral, side to side, front to back organization in which the cortex tries to explain itself and value itself in its own terms. Even though underneath that, there's still emotional juice driving it. It's trying to keep the rest of it quiet emotionally so that it can have the little bit of juice that's coming to the forebrain drive the organization of the whole brain, until eventually, when you get a hyper intellectualized person, they have come up with a model for themselves, a conception of themselves in which the frontal cortex and forebrain consciously connects to everything that they're aware of in the rest of their brain. They have made decisions about their memories. They've made decisions about their feelings. They've made decisions about their actions. They've made decisions about their thoughts and their history. And so as a result, we can imagine a new set of meaning connections that go from here out to the rest of the brain. Does that make sense? And of course, if you upset an intellectual, they will behave in a begriff way. You can, at any time, throw them off their horse and get them angry at you. And they will be angry at you because they value their ability to remain distanced from the immediacy of being driven by all that rich kaleidoscope of emotions that they had when they were in begriff. They're trying to keep this quiet enough that they can drive from up here. And they don't want you messing with that. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, this makes a much more concrete to me, your explanation, because I remember the election between George Bush the first versus Michael Dukakis. And I knew the exact moment that Dukakis lost the race. It's not like what everybody thought when he was wearing the helmet and driving a tank. It was when somebody asked him the question, like, what would you do if somebody raped your wife and disputes her, and like, how will you behave? And he gave the very liberal and rational and reasonable answer. Of course, like our judicial system, this and that and that. And I said, oh my God, he's not connecting. Right. I mean, I knew that, but this gives me a more concrete connection to that. Right. Because what he should have said was, I would be filled with so much anger and hate that, of course, I would want to kill him.
Yeah.
And then he would transition. That is exactly why I should remove myself from the decision.
Yes.
And to acquire the place and let other people handle it. Now, he could transition that into the rational part rather than, let's say, just jump right to it. Like, everybody, like, are you like a human being?
Right.
I mean, like, I just knew that he lost that because he didn't connect with it. It's like, what planet are you from,
Yes.
Because you could get to his answer, but you have to build up a condition where you will exclude yourself to a more just and rational system rather than, well, I'm going to jump right to it. Like,
yeah.
Of course, I am.
No one would understand that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, they wouldn't get it emotionally. What he did doesn't make sense emotionally. And this is one of the ways in which, begriff oriented people look for other begriff oriented people. They think they're more human and real. Whereas Verstand oriented people don't trust begriff oriented people. They want to find other Verstand oriented people who they can share their interests with and organize communities around. So there's this mutual antagonism that's based on this. It's almost as sub-rational as the way there's studies that show that people are attracted not based on the qualities that they think they're attracted based on, but based on just something as simple as scent. If somebody doesn't smell right to you, you can't be attracted to them. And that's what it's like. Kenneth Smith talks about a family scent of mentalities. You can smell after a pretty short time, not with your nose, but mentally, sort of intuitively, you can sense whether you are with fellow travelers or not. Whether, if you're a begriff, are you doing, if you're mostly begriff oriented, are you with other begriff oriented people? If you're mostly Verstand oriented, are you with other Verstand oriented people? You sense it pretty quickly. And you'll have this deep, visceral sympathy or antipathy almost immediately based on that. And it's because each of the types has to work so hard to be what they are. They don't want that threatened by somebody coming along with the antagonistic mentality and knocking you off the tracks. The intellectual doesn't want to be, doesn't want to be confronted with an interview question, how would you feel if your wife was raped, right? They don't want that. That's what they've been, that stirs up all those angry juices that they're trying to distance themselves from so that they can be a rational intellectual person. So there's this pushback. So, okay, so this is the structure of the brain. This is kind of how begriff and Verstand are reflected in it. But now if we step away from the structure and do a schematized description of the relationship of the mind to reality, I happen to have a little picture I sketched in here, a little diagram, and I'm going to try to do other ones going forwards. But this is based on the idea that in all the cartoons, we draw the human being as having a single thought balloon. But remember, the different parts of your brain are competing. It's not one whole thing. You don't have a single coherent mind that has a single thought at a time. You have all these thoughts happening at the same time because they're all lit up through these 3 dimensions of connectivity in the brain. Lots of thoughts competing, and whoever's got the most juice wins. And that's the thought that you have. And yet at the same time, you don't really just have one thought. You have at least 2 different thoughts, because you've got a begriff thought and you've got a Verstand thought, right? You've got a thought that's really driven by the emotional and sensory and experiential juice. And you've got another thought where the frontal cortex, if you are Verstand oriented, has been trying to distance itself from its emotions and come to its own conclusions. And intellectualizing, logical, schematizing thought. And which one you give priority to, it's not going to be an accident. To do the Verstand way of life takes a lot of work on your own brain. If you are overriding the begriff conclusions to arrive at Verstand conclusions, that is the result of an enormous amount of willpower and work, right? It doesn't just happen. You had to cultivate that over decades in yourself. So that's what Hegel means when he says you have abstracted out of the experience of life to become an intellectual. A Verstand thought is abstracted out of the direct immediacy of begriff thoughts. And of course, what I'm attempting to show with this diagram is that even the most immediate begriff thought about what you're perceiving in the world is still mediated by your own brain, right? It is not actually identical to this. It's got all this emotional context. And what I didn't draw here is it's also got imperfections, because we can't see the thing as it truly is. The real star is, 1,000 dimensions of connectivity with the rest of the world and implications, most of which we don't see. And so we get sort of a rich, interesting, but kind of flatland version of the truth of the thing as our begriff thought. And where a lot of the juice is in the sensations. What does it look like? What does it smell like? Blah, blah, blah. And in the emotions. How do I feel about this? Was I angered one time by this? Did I have a traffic accident one time when I reached for one of these? There's all these connections that give it context and meaning. It's very juicy. So I'm just drawing a little heart here as the symbol for the begriff form of thought, just because It's so charged with emotion. But of course, this is a dangerous symbol to choose because it suggests that this is just about feeling. Whereas begriff is also about sensation and memory and experience, right? It's the immersive, concrete, immediate experience of life, but still mediated by the brain, right? Still mediated by experience. And Verstand is the second filter, Phil. Like you were saying, it's a doubly filtered form of thinking because, you know, it's gone through our emotional centers and it's been processed. And then from that, the forebrain, determined to be the master, has attempted to suppress its emotions enough to be able to draw its own Verstand conclusions about the world, and has schematized and abstracted the sensations and suppressed everything that's merely, from its perspective, merely juice, and foregrounded all the parts of it that are the handles and levers and useful things that will let it get control of and evaluate and decide how to use the thing that's out here in the real world. So you following me so far about the relationship between kind of the two lines of thought that are coming out of the brain at the same time? You know, and if you're in a begriff mode, you just don't do this work. You just don't, right? Your brain's going to produce it anyway, but you're never going to let it be in charge. You're just going to use the Verstand stuff to serve your immediate feelings because they're so much juicier. It's so much easier to do. But if you have worked so hard to suppress your emotions and get them under control that you can be an intellectual, then you're going to be able to invest in this Verstand schematized approach to the world. And the reward comes in the power you have, your control over yourself, your control over your environment, your ability to predict the future, and your ability under modernism to rise economically and politically and socially through the ranks because of your intellectualism, because of your schematizing, because you can follow rules. And eventually, if you rise high enough, because you can change the rules, you become, you know, CEOs, you become part of Congress, you become a president. All the long-term powerful rewards under modernism are given to the Verstand-oriented personality. All the short-term immediate stuff remains with begriff where it's always been for millennia, since the origins of humanity. But modernism makes the begriff-oriented personality, the doulos, a slave. And it makes the Verstand-oriented personality the master who gets to wield the tools of civilization to be in charge of all the begriff people. Or some of the begriff people, whoever it can con, whatever. Depends on the system that you put yourself into within modernism. So, Kenneth Smith refers to this entire complex as the basal metabolism of the mind. He says, even though you have to work so hard for Verstand, you've got the capacity there from birth, and no human being can actually, you know, stop pooping themselves and start feeding themselves without investing heavily in Verstand. That abstraction and control is what makes it possible for us to become a complete human being, to become an adult. We still
have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Marianne.
Can Verstand feel empathy?
Well, remember, these things are all deeply intertwined. So at the same time you're doing your Verstand abstracted thing, you're also doing your begriff emotive experiential thing. You're feeling the empathy at the same time that you're analyzing the situation. So, and, you know, the relationships between them get complex. I can draw them as two separate thought balloons here. But of course, as we see from the descriptions of all the connectivity in the brain, it's hard to say whether they're separate or connected. They're both at the same time. So does the Verstand feel the empathy? Will you feel the empathy while you're engaging in Verstand because you're also engaging in begriff? If somehow your begriff's capabilities were cut off, you wouldn't be capable of Verstand either, because the begriff centers are the connectivity of everything. It's not possible to have Verstand without begriff. Even if you suppress the heck out of it, it's got to be in there. But it is possible to be pretty damaged in the Verstand department and still be capable of begriff, right? Because these are closer to the core. They're more necessary.
And is it also true that you could be heavily damaged in begriff but have a overdeveloped Verstand? I hope you say yes.
You can. There were is it Robert Gage, who's the guy who got the rod through his brain that damaged the emotional conscious centers of the brain? I can't remember.
Phineas.
Phineas Gage. Thank you. There we go. And didn't he lost empathy, was it, among other things, but he could still think about the world. So that would seem to argue that you're right, Dave, that you can.
Just think of any sociopath or psychopath, right?
Right. And in those cases, you know, they don't need a rod through the brain. They just need to have the experiences that damage them and suppress them and force them to try to get control over themselves to such an extent that they actually lose touch with their emotions and they can't feel the empathy. It could even still be being generated just like it was before the psychological damage, but they have so distanced themselves and abstracted themselves, as Hegel would describe it, that that they can treat people like resources and say, well, I think I'll kill you and eat you because that way you can't ever leave me, as the classic example.
And to a certain extent, our hyperlogos culture is forcing all of us to become sociopathic just to be able to make it in the world.
Yeah, that's right. There are many things about the modern world that are perfectly systematized, but that don't make any sense emotionally and that make us angry. And we would like to change them. And if we try to change them, we get punished for it. So it encourages us to suppress our emotions about those things. Feelings that people have about traffic tickets or about watching a speeder fly by you and endangering everybody around you. And then you get a traffic ticket. You were going 2 miles an hour over the law and nobody pulled that guy over and you get angry and you're like, this is not a justice system. This is an injustice system. But if you say that to the cop, you get a bigger ticket. So you learn to suppress your emotions in order to fit within the system, right?
Aren't there quite a number of CEOs who are considered psychopaths? Or
yes, or sociopaths at least.
Sociopaths, yeah.
Yeah. That there are certain activities where empathy makes it hard to do the job. Ripping off a whole bunch of people of their healthcare, for example, so you can profit off them. That's easier to do if you suppress your conscience. And it shows up in interesting places like surgery, where you can only save lives by cutting people up if cutting people up doesn't horrify and disgust you. You've got to be able to separate yourself from your feelings and see the person as an object with dotted lines for where you cut. My friend who taught me all this neuroanatomy and neurophysiology, who was working with the University of Washington, he said, you know, there's cartoon versions of how different doctors see the world that nobody ever talks about. But, you know, when a surgeon looks at a person, they see a bunch of dotted lines for where to cut. It's like, you know, different procedures have different, remove this, cut this, sew these together, you know, and other doctors who don't engage in those activities just don't see people that way. You know, a psychotherapist doesn't see you as a bunch of detachable parts. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I have an example. It's not a great example because, you know, like it's not so dramatic, but it was something that I was caught in. One day I was kind of late for appointment. So I was like trying to get there in time without breaking the rules. And what happened was somebody who was in front of me was driving in the 35-mile zone at 25. And I said, oh, come on. And then finally, I saw an opportunity to pass them. Okay. And I did. I thought it was reasonable, maybe a little bit rude, but it was reasonable considering what it was. Because usually people go 40 or 45 in that stretch. Okay. So I said, come on. So, and then, of course, she got very angry and start like trying to race me. So now the race is on. Okay. And I'm into it. The race is on. And finally, we got to the freeway and there was a freeway thing and she trying to overtake me to pass me that has a payback. I could easily have outraced her or lean in such a way to run her off the road. I said, no, this is like way beyond. I mean, like, forget about it, right? So my reason finally came back is that this is not worth it. But I could have seen a possibility where okay, if you want to go into the ditch,
right,
go ahead.
Right.
I was, of course, concerned with myself being charged if I ran somebody off the road. I didn't run them off the road, but whatever. But I was more concerned with her being unreasonable, and I knew she was going to do it, right? No matter what. I said, no, this is not worth it. So in a sense, you do come back to your senses if you allow yourself to. In
Yes.
that sense. So it's not like a earth-shaking example, but it was an example where I got caught into, I thought she unjustly treat me because like she started it as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
And I said, oh, forget it. Like, let it go.
Right. Right. And you know, that road rage example illustrates the fascinating relationship between Verstand and Begriff, because the road rage is this great surge of the emotional centers of the brain based on past experience and limbic reactions and all kinds of things. But then turning it around into the abstraction of a road race in which they are not a person but an opponent in the race is a very Verstand thing to do. Right. And a newborn can't conceptualize the world that way, or other people or themselves. That kind of role playing, the manipulation of a machine in order to achieve objectives. This is all Verstand brain. And yet at the very moment that you're doing this Verstand abstraction of the other person and your relationship to them, it's fueled by this amazing Begriff drive. So this is what I mean about they're both going on at the same time. It just becomes this question of who's serving whom. And of course, under modernism, we role play back and forth, whether we're being a doulos or a bonausos in different parts of our life. You know, the same person who's a CEO who feels in control all the time might do really well to not try to be in control when they're pulled over for a ticket, for example. You know, because at that moment, if they try to be in charge of the relationship with the police officer, it's not going to end badly for them. So this kind of who is to be master thing is constantly shifting in us between these two modes, which seem to cover the whole gamut. I mean, when you look at a picture like this, it seems to say that's all there could be. What else could there be, right? This is everything. The sum total of life is these two parts being put together. But of course, this is where the existential line of philosophy from Heraclitus through Hegel, through Kierkegaard and Marx and Nietzsche and Hannah Arendt and Philip Reef and oh God, there's others. I was reading a whole bunch of them today, and then Kenneth Smith comes through, which says, no, there's a third faculty we are also born with, but it is suppressed under modernism, and it's made to seem like it couldn't even exist. There's no room for it. That's why we equate them with the hemispheres. You do have two hemispheres, not three hemispheres. So there must only be two faculties, right? There's these logical propositions are built into the language and the structure of our thought to make it seem like they're inherently complete, and to keep them from ever having to make the claim out loud that there's only two. Because you can see for yourself there's only two hemispheres. So they don't have to say there's only two mentalities. They just have to tie the mentalities artificially to the hemispheres and leave you to conclude there's no room for anything else. This is how it works with every piece of language you could use to talk about the third mentality, not just hemispheres, not just left versus right, not just feeling versus thinking, but everywhere throughout modernism. All the structures of thought and meaning and axiology are all built in such a way, like law and order versus anarchy. Right? We learn law and order versus anarchy. And again, it's the excluded middle. There are two possibilities and only two possibilities. But if they came out and said there's only two possibilities, it would encourage contrarians of every stripe to go, is that true? Could I come up with a third? But by never saying it and just building it into the structure of the language, it prevents us from asking the question, why should we believe there's only two? Right? So all these guys, all these existential philosophers say there's three, there's a third. There's the third one that's possible. And you can see the need for it right here. Now, at any moment, I'm going to get pinged and have to take care of the cat. When I do, I'll stop sharing, and you guys can continue the conversation, and it'll be recorded, and I'll pick it up later. I'll watch the recording after David posts it, but then I'll come back after 10 minutes. But for now, let's see how far I can get in this. The problem is this. Between these three stars, only one of them is true. Only one of them is true, because the actual world is actual. That is actually the star, right? This is a Begriff interpretation of a star, and this is a Verstand interpretation of a star. But neither of them is a star. This is where Parmenideanism and Platonism gets weird, when they start talking about the cosmos as actually these perfect, unchanging ideal forms that exist in the realm of ideas, and ideas are real, and the rest of the world isn't real and is just a shadow or reflection of them. This kind of thing is an inside out escapist philosophy, because what we all know in our bones, or what our body knows, is that when you accidentally stray onto the freeway and a truck's bearing down on you, you don't say, well, that truck's not real, only my idea of a truck is real, so if I can disbelieve the truck, I'll live. You don't do that. Not even a Platonist does that. Everybody goes, truck, and they die for it, because now no matter how stupid the brain gets, the body knows, for the love of God, watch out, right? One of these things is more real than the other. The problem is, even though the body knows that this is the real star, a doulos is so invested in begriff that they behave as though this is the real star, right? They're not constantly going back to double check their idea of the star against the real star. They're not constantly saying, I know the star in my head is wrong, so I must always be looking for the mistakes in my thoughts. They don't do that. That's not a begriff thing to do. That's too abstracted. You cannot be coinciding perfectly and immediately and profoundly full of juice with your experience of life while simultaneously questioning it. That is not a begriff thing to do. They're incompatible with each other. It is a Verstand thing to do to criticize the begriff experience of life, right? So a doulos isn't really going to do this much. They're going to mistake the star in their head for the star that's out in reality. So you can see the error in this diagram right away. Somebody who invests their notion of the source of truth in their own begriff ideas is inherently mistaken. They cannot be other than mistaken. It is a foolish thing to do. And specifically, it is an idiotic thing to do. They are more interested in their own, and idiotia, right? In the meaning one's own. They're more interested in their own star, the star in their head, their own star, than they are in the star that's not their own. The things that are theirs have value to them, their feelings, their experiences, their memories, their charge. That's what's important. It's ultimately a form of emotional egotism or experiential egotism to think that one's own conception of the star is more important than the real star. Richard, go ahead. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. So I'm not sure if I'm seeing some perplexed expressions on the chat, but like, I mean, part of it is that, like, you know, at least on the slide, the star, you know, looks more or less the same.
It does.
But so I kind of had this experience, you know, very vividly a few years ago when that social media meme with the gold and white dress, or the black and blue dress.
Yes.
And it was a really interesting mind-opening experience in that, like, okay, like, so it's different than optical illusions, in that in optical illusions, like, once you kind of understand the trick, then you can see past the deception usually.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, this drawing isn't quite done yet. What I really should be doing is a photograph of a tree that's just beautiful, and then a beautiful drawing of a tree over here, and then a schematized description of a tree over on the right.
But like, so I still see that dress as white and gold, but then, like, you know, when this phenomenon happened, like, you know, it's like the Verstand side of my brain, you know, was able to kind of like deconstruct it and, like, okay, see the listing of the dress, like, on the website, you know, and in that light it's clearly black and blue. Right. And then, like, if you do certain things, like where you sort of like block out the like parts, and you just sort of like kind of compare a shade, like, and then like compare to a shade like in isolation, like, you can see that you know, like, it's black and blue. But then when I still look at the dress, then I still see it as white and gold. And I was able to, like, you know, understand that I was seeing it incorrectly. You know, and then the evidence is very clear that it wasn't. But then, like, discussing with a friend who also saw it in like incorrectly as white and gold, like, she was very invested in that she was seeing it clearly, and I'm trying to convince her, no, we're not. I'm like, but it was I don't know, it seems silly and kind of trivial, I think, at that time, but I think it was very beneficial as an experience. Yeah.
I got to step away. Back in 10 minutes. I turn it over to you guys.
Oh no, what will happen?
I've been thinking about what Phil has been talking about, and the city gates. And when I was walking in downtown Seattle, the city is vacated. It's pretty much the workers aren't there. A lot of the homeless have created tents. The energy of the city has collapsed. But in the suburbs, like, on Bainbridge Island where I live, it seems much more normal. And it's like the margins are still alive, but the deep-hearted part of that city. And then I was thinking about environmentalism. They always say to watch the margins, like if you have weeds in the margins. And it's interesting that it's just kind of the opposite, where the heart of the city is vacant.
Well, I could say something about, who was it that spoke? I said before about the dress that was white. I mean, artists know about simultaneous contrast. But I pointed out several weeks ago, when you see like a good optical illusion visually, it is an illusion, but your mind tells you it's not an illusion. I mean, because it appears. So in some ways, your vision, your mind sees it more real than reality, because even though you can't unsee what you see. So in a sense, and that has to do with the limitation of the visual system in this case, which I know a little bit about, is built in such a way that it can never really recover a reality. Because let's say if you look at the color wheel, which an artist makes, and the spectrum of light is very, very different. And in some ways, because in order to catch the spectrum, if that is a reality and translate it into colors, so that's a much more accurate proximity of the real world, then the unfortunate thing is there are thousands, perhaps millions of spectral wavelengths that has to be translated. In order to fit that into an eye to capture one signal at a time, that's actually an accurate measurement of that particular signal, your eyes will have to be the size of a football field for one of them to catch that particular beam, right? Well, that's gonna not be operative. And not only that, if it was the size of the football field, you can't build a kind of organization, because you got one signal here and you got the next signal at the other football field, and you can't congeal it into a whole. So what the eye has to deal with is the physical limitations of generating, I guess, some kind of generative system that could receive light. And what it came up with was a simulation, which is that you have three chemicals that could transfer, each one of them absorbing the entire spectrum of light that you could see, but at different points of efficiency. So when these three things, now it's down to three, is packed together, you could see a more unified whole, but it's inaccurate, but it does make a simulation. So what happened when you see these signals together, because one neuron will be able to see red, other green and blue, but at different function of efficiency. And so when it's translated into the brain at the first level, the brain is computational. In other words, 643 could mean a certain kind of red, and let's say 621 could be a different combination of red, but they register as a red, which is different. And that has to do with how the filter is that receive those signals. So the limitation on the chemistry and the limitation of building 3 layers that coordinates into a computational network that is in terms of numbers. However, what that does is allows you, in a sense now, through media, to create a similar fact representation of that by these 3 kind of basic colors, so that you could simulate the simulation of your experience, not the way the world is. So that has to do with that's just a structure and limitation of what chemically your eye could do, and how functionally, how much space there is to tightly pack the receptors so that they could actually distinguish detail. Because because if one signal is like a size of a football field, you can't see much detail, even if you had eyes that big.
I have a question. Do you think Vistants actually feel fulfillment?
A certain kind, I think. I mean,
I think they could probably feel intellectual fulfillment, but I think that's what drives, a lot of these super successful people to continue going, because there's a hole in their heart, Marianne. They don't have the soul fulfillment.
I put a heart on the puppet I'm making for my grandson, because
that is adorable. I think this is something that you see very common with, people in industry that have achieved incredible amounts of success. They get to a point in their life, they say, I should be happy, but I'm not. That's like a Verstant intellectually understanding, hey, I got the big house, I got 2 cars, I got, great job, I have the huge bank account. What's wrong here? I'm supposed to have everything. I won the game. But they don't feel that. And I think that's, they've lost touch with that emotional processing in a certain way.
Well, like Rene Girard speaks about and you'll see when you get to these kind of super wealthy is they see themselves as competitors to other super wealthy, and kind of moving up the Forbes list, or kind of right now you see this competitiveness between Musk and Jeff Bezos, right? And they're all trying to one up each other. And Rene Girard calls this a form of deviated transcendency. And it's the kind of also kind of in our modern age, what he calls the ontological sickness. But really, if you kind of look down and it's really based truly on nothing. It's this Verstand, we create these systematic ways of seeing and valuing the world, but it's not fulfilling to the core, I don't think.
And I see it in the stock market. There's really a lot of hoarding going on. The rich and the poor, there's a huge division right now, and they're getting into trillions, and they're not happy enough.
Mm-hmm.
No, they're convinced that actually that's necessary in order to be happy. For a whole society, they think that the world needs billionaires or things or trillionaires in order to be happy. It's this, but the Verstand, I don't know. I mean, it is good. I don't think a Verstand can be happy. I think it just has to, by in and of itself,
satisfied. It can be content, but not happy.
Yeah, but it has to continually feed itself.
As you say, Joseph, to a Verstand, more is always going to be better. That's just their logic, right? It must be. If 1 is good, 2 must be better, and 3 has to be even more. So that's why they keep going.
Well, and also, when you're so committed to your self-esteem arising from being above other people, you generate hierarchies that you would be terrified to fall in. And so you exist in this state of existential angst, where even though you think it won't happen to you, you can always look around and see other, ultra rich people who lost everything. And so there's this low-lying thing of, I've made a world in which I would hate to be the victim of the things I've set in motion, and it could happen, but I can't seem to stop myself from making it even more so.
Right.
And as you point out, Marianne,
well,
maybe
well,
that's why society encourages the haves and the have-nots to serve as a perpetual reminder to keep people trapped in this sociological perspective that even though they may have everything they need now, they might not have it in the future. So keep going, keep doing it. Don't give back, right? It just continues to promote that. And that's why some of these problems are so vexing for us to solve. I mean, if we really wanted to, we could solve hunger and homelessness. It's just a lack of political will that prevents those answers and solutions from being put into effect. It's not
Right.
difficult intellectually.
Right.
Well, I need to disagree with that to a certain degree, because I think human beings do need some sort of understanding, and I think forms are kind of important. You just have to, number one, not lose your heart in the meantime, and number two, of course, not be trapped by the very form that you're trying to build, because one of the things that is great is that we've built a kind of language which has its limitations, but the language allows us to communicate information that's beyond ourselves. But if you understand that language has its own limits, then in a sense, then you'll understand that in a sense is imperfect. As long as you realize that way of thinking is imperfect, or allow yourself to understand that, then you know that you can open up the possibility. Of course, the first thing is you got to not lose your heart in the meantime, right? As a matter of fact, I had the discussion, I was in another meeting about, I guess, two students of what's his name, like I'm not Lao Tzu, but Confucius, right? And it was very interesting. One student, that they were both very honored students of Confucius, and one said human beings are basically good, and the other one said basically bad. I happen to think they're a mixture of both. Okay, but nonetheless, I asked how did badness come in the world of in the society if human beings are basically good? And I said, don't you start off good, and the only way you could go is like either stay where you are, which is good, or you get better. But I use the word gooder because if there's no negative to go along with that, then you're just gooder and gooder. How did bad come into this into society? You know, okay, it's the corruption of society, and maybe that's the case. But how did the corruption come in unless there was something bad to begin with that possibly could infiltrate? The other one, I said, how about if human nature is bad, then how did goodness come into existence in the human being? I said, either like there's somehow, some way you could learn goodness, but which does not exist. If that's the case, then how could you come to a good place? I said, it must be because some ancient sage have understood what goodness is, and you're just merely passing that on, which makes that ancient sage the foundation of society, rather than a development of society. And therefore, in a sense, you're always looking to the past, the sage, and they become a demigod, which is essentially what Confucius become. You know, like I said, that's just not the motto either, because how does goodness come in if everything is bad? You start off bad, everybody's bad, it gets worse and worse because you're trying to outbad each other. I think human beings have both potential, and what civilization does is allow you to develop the potential one way or the other. And so therefore, in a sense, it could be good, become good, or it could become bad. Only then, because the potential is always there. And I think, which means that in a sense, you have to, the first thing you have to do to be a good human being is to understand yourself, that you're yourself, there is badness in you, and you have to keep that under control. As an example, like the race is on, right? Okay, I mean, like, okay, the race is on. I could have easily ran her off the road if I didn't care. You know, finally I said, oh, you know, I care about this too much. She, for whatever reason, needed to win. Just let her win. You know, I mean, that sort of thing, right? So you have to never lose sight that you are capable of doing that. because if you do not understand you're capable of doing that, then you actually in your heart do not have enough forgiveness for other who is on his way to being bad you could bring back.
Right. Right. Thank you, Phil. Richard, and then if you guys are game, I can take us to Vernunft from where we left off. Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, we were talking about, like whether people who are deeply invested in Verstand can be happy. And I guess I was just sort of just reflecting on like what a perfect symbol like of sort of the nihilistic kind of Verstand times like that we're living in, which is like Dogecoin. And who is also being pumped by kind of this nihilist of our time, like Elon Musk. And it's sort of kind of like the psychological social phenomenon you kind of see like with influencers with their with their audience, like how they kind of feel out their audience and they respond to what kind of gets them the most positive feedback. I mean, you sort of see Trump do this when he's in rallies, right? Like he kind of sees what kind of gooses the audience and kind of like and kind of like changes directions to kind of give them more of it. And like but it's deep down, it's kind of rooted in this kind of insecurity, right? You see this with Elon Musk too, which has everything. It's like he gets this perverse pleasure by like tweeting about and goosing up Dogecoin, but then like a few days earlier he's like, oh, like maybe he's realized, okay, like this is starting to get a little crazy. It's like, please be, please take caution when investing, and then like and I think a lot of people were kind of riding it to his SNL appearance this Saturday, and like then basically like there's tons of people heading for the exits, and then like for Elon Musk, I imagine like like how kind of like Trump kind of tied his ego with like the stock market, and like how we're doing so good and doing so good, and then like when he's on SNL, then like his like Dogecoin like tanks quite a bit. And then, like you sort of see his move today, which is trying to boost it back up again, like kind of boost his own ego by saying, oh, you're going to be able to pay with SpaceX, like with Dogecoin. So it's just kind of interesting. Like, you know what I'm talking about, Rick?
Yeah.
But sort of on a separate track, kind of on dialectical thinking, like, what, like the slide you just had up. And then I guess, between like the, actuality, like the reality, like the, Begriff and Verstand kind of views of it. Like it's kind of reminding me of another kind of dialectical kind of framework that I've been studying lately, which is Jacques Lacan, which I don't know if I'm going to buy into his whole kit and caboodle, but like at least the way he kind of partitions it into like the big R real order, the imaginary order, and the symbolic order, I think are quite interesting and useful.
Yeah. That really applies here. So we're sort of laying out the why Kenneth Smith calls both Begriff and Verstand together collectively the basal metabolism of the mind. And we talked about the way that, we're born into Begriff, but we have to fight for and develop Verstand. But that everybody does develop Verstand because human beings are born incomplete compared to other mammals. We're born extremely underdeveloped, and we really have to work to finish ourselves. And that working of finishing ourselves exercises the Verstand side of the brain. And I say side, but of course I don't really mean hemisphere, as we said earlier. I saw Sharon joined us. The left brain, right brain thing doesn't quite line up with this because, Kenneth Smith says this isn't about hemispheres. Not really. This is about faculties of the mind. So, we all develop Verstand in order to finish ourselves and become competent to feed ourselves and move about in the world. But whether we let Begriff be the master or Verstand be the master and make the other ones serve us really determines which of two major camps of human character we fall into. Because a whole galaxy of consequences flows from that choice. Which one is in charge changes everything about what our limits and liabilities will be and what our powers and insights will be. And thereby, it changes the way we see the world. Our very worldview is different if we're dualic, meaning we've put Begriff in charge, or whether we're Banausic, meaning we've put Verstand in charge, right? And we can struggle around as far as, there's a huge amount of variation around these two strange attractors. There's a lot of different kinds of Dualoi. There's a lot of different kinds of Banausoi. We're all individuals, et cetera, but we're orbiting one of those two areas because of the repellency, the exclusiveness of these two decisions. And people who try to straddle the fence are in a difficult position, because what do you use as the basis for decision making about who's right? If you are relying on your feelings and experiences of life to tell you what's true, then Verstand is by definition the servant, because you're overriding it whenever you don't like its conclusions. But if you're using your education and your logic and intellect to make decisions about what's true, then by definition, you're Banausic, because you're overriding your experiences of life whenever they don't fit into your system. And if you're just sort of rolling a die and randomly hopping back and forth between them, well, mostly people just don't do that. So Phil talks about the standing at the city gate between the wilderness, the world of nature outside, and the world of humanity inside, the civilization. And that's the struggle we have, is that when we come to recognize that both the dualic approach to life and the Banausic approach to life are both forms of idiocy, one deciding that my own experiences are the source of truth and meaning, and the other one deciding my chosen ideas and systems are the source of meaning, but they're both my own thoughts, my own feelings, my own systems, my own experiences. Idiota. This is what makes them both forms of idiocy. They're both turning inward and saying that the brain, whether they know it or not, they're saying the brain, whether they call it a soul or a spirit or a feeling or a mind, the brain is the source of truth and not the reality that it's looking at. There is a fundamental escapist flaw built into both forms of idiocy. And the escapist flaw is thinking that Kafka was wrong, thinking that, when you're up against the world, that you win and the world is wrong, that you get to dictate terms to reality about what's true. Now that is the inescapable addiction and temptation of both of these forms of idiocy. It's what makes them basal metabolism. You need them both. You have to have them both to develop into a full person. But if you stop at that level, then you're stuck in a mode in which you miscomprehend the relationship between the self and reality. And you start to think that the reality that you project through your Begriff way of life or your Verstand way of life is reality itself. And you just sort of start suppressing and ignoring everything out in the actual world that isn't consistent. And of course, as we've talked about with the Procrustean bed and all of these other, and the labyrinth and all these other metaphors, the human capacity to play foreground, background games with the truth of the world that's constantly coming into us is essentially infinite. We can make anything fit the bed of our mind if we're determined enough and passionate enough. And that means it's extremely hard for the actual world to intrude and prove to us that we're wrong. It's easier for that to happen when the things we're wrong about are minor details, and that if we fix them, everything still fits within the schema of our life choices. But the more things are called into question by the evidence that we're confronted with, the more work it would be for us to reconcile it, the less we want to actually do that work. And the more we want to fall back on the easy reflex of just suppressing the information we don't want. And for that reason, the thing that is most hard, the hardest of all things to do, is for a doulos to realize that the doulic way of life doesn't work. Or for a Banausos to realize that the Banausic way of life doesn't work, because that calls everything into question. They've organized their entire worldview around Verstand or Begriff. It's too much work, and they're just not going to let it be possible that they could be wrong at that fundamental level. And that's how they become self-enclosures. That's how they become self-enclosures. That's why they become self-enclosures. And that's why they become isolated from each other. So the problem is from this perspective, if we're neither listening to our experience of life nor to our ideas and education about life to determine what's true, well, then from the left brain, right brain model of the world, there aren't any other choices and we're stuck. It's got to be one or the other. And this is why dispensing with the notion that this is about hemispheres is essential, so that we get rid of the notion that there can only be two choices. We need to get back to the structural model that shows us the relationship between Verstand, Begriff, and the actual world, so that we can see there is a third source of truth. It's just a difficult one. And a third source of truth is to turn around, stop looking inside of our head and start looking outside of our head. And to say, the truth must be out here, right? Kafka's right. In the contest between yourself and the world, back the world, not yourself. The world is right. I don't mean the human world of civilization and choices and laws. I mean, whatever is actually out there in the cosmos, regardless of human beings looking at it, that's actual. Even though we have difficulty getting at it for a variety of reasons, that's the ultimate source of truth. And this is where it gets really challenging because, as Heraclitus says, nature loves to hide. Mm-hmm. Right? There's too many details to the world. There's too much to pay attention to. It's hard to figure out which are the important parts to tell you what matters. There's a layering that goes from epistemology, where you just try to figure out what's true, to the layer of meaning, where you try to figure out what that truth means, to the layer of axiology, where you figure out based on those meanings what is right and wrong, what should you do in your life. And if you get it wrong at the bottom level, where your epistemology is wrong because you think the truth comes from your experiences or from your education and systems of ideas, then right off the bat, you're going to get meaning wrong and you're going to get ethics, morality, axiology wrong because they're constructed atop that. This is where Kant derives not axiology, but ethics from his intellectualized Verstand schema. And you can find emotionalist, experientialist, basically Begriff dualic approaches to trying to construct morality as well, where they say, what I feel, look into your heart and your heart will tell you right from wrong. You know, that's only true if you've cultivated your Begriff side to be sensitive to those things. You could just as easily have been miscultivated to long for things that are bad for you or bad for other people. And then if you look into your heart, you're going to get bad answers. The idea that intuition is malleable and can be acculturated in good directions or bad directions is something that a Begriff dualic person cannot handle because it calls into question the entire dualic way of life. So if we are to take a third path, then we have to try to work out what are the parts of reality that matter the most, that are the most essential, that are the most enlightening, that connect to the most other things and power the most other things, so that they have massive explanatory power. And from those we attempt to derive meaning, and from that meaning we attempt to derive right and wrong, axiology. This is much less sure, much less certain, and it's a lot of work compared to either going with what you have already experienced or what you have already learned. And it's even more work. There's also Verstand approaches and Begriff approaches that say, well, go experience more life and enrich your pool of experience so that you've got more to draw on, or go get more education, learn more things, think about things more. Right? Be more rational, we always say, be more reasonable, and you'll be a better person. But as Kenneth Smith says over and over, the problem with these is that instead of confronting the problems with these two mentalities, they're doubling down on it and say, well, if I just do it more, it will fix the problems that it has. You know, as though an engine with a blown piston will fix itself if you just press the accelerator. It's like, no. In fact, the busted piston spinning around inside the engine is making the engine worse, not better. You know, so that's you should be backing up and re-questioning your basal foundations. But neither of these mindsets can do that because they have already made the unconscious choice to turn away from the world and into themselves, to seek within themselves for sources of truth and meaning and right and wrong. So this is the basal metabolism that helps to set the stage for what could the third mentality possibly be. by definition, it has to involve turning away and saying, yes, I need to know what I feel and what I've experienced and what I sense. I need to attend closely to that, because there are strengths in that that we lose when we become overly Verstand. But there are also strengths in Verstand, in analysis and study, that we lose if we're overly Begriff. We need both things. And when they disagree with each other, or when they both agree but they're both wrong, we need some other source of truth and meaning to reconcile them with each other and help us figure out where we should go. This is where Hegel's critique of Kantian thesis, antithesis, synthesis gets so juicy, right? Because the idea that if we just reconcile our thoughts and our feelings with each other, we'll arrive at the truth, is to accept the basal assumption that one or the other or both of them are already right. But what if they're both wrong? If we reconcile them with each other, all we've done is multiply their wrongness by each other. So you can't just mechanically, Kantianly use synthesis to resolve the problems that come from one or the other worldview. You need a third source of authority. You can't just compromise or balance between them. You need some other source of authority that is less prone to error than these two, and that also less compounds its own pre-existing error whenever it tries to solve its problems. And where are you going to look for that? It's got to be outside yourself. We have to look out to the world, which is, as we'll talk about shortly, a very, very hard thing to do. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I do have a question about that, because it seems to me that nature not only hides, but there's something about you, your own perceptual instrumentation, that you cannot see the world in this sense. We know that there's a blind spot, and I talked about that from the very beginning, that in the blind spot, your mind actually dictates that you generate a synthesis in order to complete that thing, because otherwise you could fall into the hole and you never know about it, right?
Yes.
So you create this synthesis, which is not real, but it papers over what reality is, what you want and what you think.
Yes.
It actually is out there in the world, but
Yes.
it's not real, okay?
Right. Right.
So that's one. Number two, when we look at all the colors we could see, I've talked about that while you're away, but I'm going to talk about something else. If you look at the color wheel, in a sense, most people don't understand the color wheel is not a wheel, but actually a horseshoe that's connected at the bottom. Because purple, we actually cannot see.
Yes.
In terms of what it is and the light waves. Now, maybe butterflies could see it, but we can't see it. But we could generate it by the mixture of synthetic mixture of the red, green, and blue, okay?
Yes.
And so we could see that, and which is coming in a sense from our imagination. What do we imagine it would be if there was a purple, okay?
Right, right.
So in that sense, it's almost as if you need the imagination, which is not real, in order to authenticate the reality that it might be that way, which it could also be that you want it that way. Okay, you can say that is a limitation in our eyes in terms of receiving data to actually generate information, which generate knowledge and wisdom or whatever, okay, that built on that. But if your body lies to you, you can say, oh, okay, well, we got a way to solve that. We have science that create instrumentation. We have microscopes, we have spectrographs that could sense these things, but we don't know what it is, okay?
Excuse me.
And in addition, somebody want to interrupt? Okay. In addition, what happened is these instrumentations are instrumentation that mimic our understanding of what perception is, okay? So therefore, we can't really trust the instrumentation itself because it is built by us with our limited understanding of the world. So we have to first overcome, in order to see the way the world actually is, we have to overcome the limitations of what we can see, construct in ourselves in terms of seeing the world as it is, as the first step. So I have a problem with that. And that leads me to the believe that, in a sense, that imagination is very, very important, even though it could go in the very wrong way, like the super fantastical, right? But it's
Right.
also the way that we could actually have access to this thing that's halfway between the make-believe land and what could possibly be.
Thank you,
Phil,
Phil.
for Carl Jung, active imagination is the way to access the collective unconsciousness. So Carl Jung agrees with you.
Mhm.
Sharon, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Well, I couldn't let this day go by without saying hi to all my friends, no matter how late I was going to be.
So good to see you.
So thank you for accepting me. So I have a question for Phil, because I see that blind spot as personality. And that personality has a significant genetic component. And there's the ongoing debate of nature versus nurture as to what is the final output of the personality. So I'm interested in any comment on that.
Hey. Go right ahead.
Am I too far off? I don't know. I'm asking.
So nature versus nurture in this context, part of what's interesting is that, Kenneth talks about this a lot, that there, if we have to start with Heraclitus, who tells us that the lawful nature that has its logos, that makes it, a coherent whole because it does things in a lawful fashion, is not only around us, but it's within us. Our body, but also our mind follows its own laws of nature that are as binding upon it as gravity is upon our body. And we, especially moderns who believe that we have a birthright of freedom and that we're free by birth and not by any effort of our own, are deeply backwards when it comes to having any capacity to recognize that we might be bound by inner laws of the mind and character and their development. So we want to think we're free. Laws would interfere with our freedom. So we want to think that inside it's all just a big playground. We can do whatever we want. We don't want to think, actually, there's the equivalent of gravity and electricity and heartbeats and all these things that are going on inside the brain outside of our control, and that we may have very little leverage upon, but they have enormous leverage over us, right? And so there's that to begin with, as far when we talk about nature. The second thing when we talk about nature is we have to take in the ancient Greek perspective of teleology, the idea that we're seeds and that we contain our future selves, and that we're in the process of othering, of becoming somebody different than we are right now. And that othering isn't just something that happens to us from without, but it's also something that happens to us from within, as the lawful acting out of our character and our minds is also the lawful transformation of our minds and our character. That they contain the seeds of their own future order, and they are unfolding themselves into new configurations based on the old configurations. And this is going on all the time according to their own laws and rules, most of which we're blind to, because as moderns, we think that we're free in there. We can do whatever we want, and there isn't some kind of massive momentum or series of transformations that we're in the middle of. So that's the second thing to say about nature, is that, we not only have these constraints inside us, but these constraints are moving us from one place to another, from one character to another, from one mindset to another. And then on top of that, because we're living systems and not mechanisms, we are sensitive to and adapting to the circumstances we find ourselves in. And again, a bunch of that's conscious, but a bunch of that's unconscious, even more of it's unconscious. And that means that we are acculturating, adapting organisms. So our parents can acculturate us, and our schools can acculturate us, and television shows and news shows and society at large can acculturate us. So, and that acculturation process isn't just something that happens to us, but it's something that the structure of our mind and character wants to happen, because we're born incomplete and in need of acculturation. All mammals are, but we're born that way to an even greater extent than other mammals are. So we lawfully, and it's weird to say that the unconscious does anything deliberately, but let's just say it. The unconscious deliberately engages in letting itself be acculturated by its circumstances. The child wants to develop, whether they know it or not. Their brain wants to pick up language, as Chomsky says. There's a yearning, a need, a drive for language. And as we pick up language, the abstractions of language develop our Verstand and mold us in different directions. So as a result, I mean, the obvious answer to nature or nurture when you look at the sum total is both turned up to 11. It's like you have two accelerators, your car is moving in two different directions, and the child's character presses down on both pedals at the same time and says, go, go, go. We are both going to unfold according to the seeds within us and what they want to do. And part of what those seeds want to do is be responsive to the culture around us and make us a part of it as a greater whole than just ourselves.
So is that the blind spot, Rick, that Phil, I'm just trying to get it in my head. Is that the blind spot that Phil was talking about? That we have no control over it? I'm trying to make a connection.
Do you think,
the
Phil,
whole thing.
How does that relate to the blind spot you were talking about, Phil?
I think it's different, but I like what you're suggesting. So I'll have to think about it. I mean, my point was that the blind spot came from just the way that it's possible for us to even organize a structure. Right. That's all I mean by it. But I like the way, because that blind spot could be equal to, okay, in this way it does relate. It could be equal to what I call imagination, that in a sense, because imagination does live halfway between fantasy and representation. Okay. Yes. So therefore, in a sense, that blind spot, in a sense, how can I put it? I'll just use a metaphor. Maybe it's probably the wrong metaphor, but it's like we're born in the Garden of Eden, and there's the apple. We're not supposed to eat it. That's our blind spot. And we want to eat it. And because we ate it, we're cursed with the fact that we ate it, that we want to know what the hell it is, but we were punished because we're not supposed to know. So in a sense, I think that myth actually makes sense. You know, it's like if you want to call, like, this is sexist, the old man is playing a trick on us, forcing us to eat the apple because he knew that we would, and that we're punished for it, for eating it, and that's what we are. And therefore, we are pushed into a situation which we have to use imagination now in order to fill the void.
Yes. Yeah, and you know, I'll call on James in just a second, but there's a way in which the inherent blind spots of the dualic life, which is so begriff centered, and the inherent blind spots of the Verstand life, which is of the Banausic life, which is so Verstand centered, those blind spots are within their own exclusive terms inescapable, but they're different from each other. And so if you could somehow get these two horses to stop arguing with each other about which one of them is in charge, and instead have neither of them be in charge and have them harness to the actual world and its needs, then you could use their blind spots and the things that are not blind in what they see to cancel each other out and see more than you could otherwise see, right? Because sometimes the begriff horse is going to see stuff that the Verstand horse misses, and sometimes vice versa. But as long as you let one of them always call the shots, your blind spots become a symptom of its blind spots. So what you want is for neither of them to be in charge. So you can listen to them both and go, you know, I hear you saying everything is fine, but I hear this other horse saying, actually, watch out for this cliff over here. And I'm at least going to look and see if there's a cliff. I mean, it might be wrong, but he might be right, right? So you could try to triangulate on the truth once you have two perspectives going. But the dualic mindset and the Banausic mindset don't want two perspectives. Each of them wants to be the only perspective, which is where we get into trouble. And that's where you need the heuristic. The point of the Aristos, the point of Vernunft, is that it is the first form of mentality that refuses the monism, the monotheism, if you will, of the other two mentalities. It's the first one that says we need multiple perspectives to try to help us triangulate on the actual star and not get entirely hung up on the star in our heads, right? Which we have to acknowledge is not the real star. I'll come back to that in a moment, because this is where the rest of this discussion today goes. Is we're gonna have a discussion about archive and principles and world powers and all kinds of kind of deep, potent stuff is about to happen. But let me call on the hands we got here. James first. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's so many modern philosophers. It goes back to Heraclitus too, where we are human beings are such dependent on nurturing that we are like the livestock, that Heraclitus refers to as the hungry livestock. Even next to a pasture needs to prod.
Yes.
So because we depend on nurturing so much that that we even after we've developed to adulthood, we're still depending on the other, the they. Heidegger refers to the they. We depend on the they to individuate us to adulthood, but not enough that we continue to depend on the they or the other in the or the superego in Freud, and the other, the big other, in the Lacan, right?
Yes.
And so, I can't help but think that Begriff and Verstand are really, the result of being captivated still by the other or by the they. And that, the society we grow up in, we live in, makes a lot of difference. And the story of Robinson Crusoe, right, is a kind of, I think one of the points is that he lands on this island and he's isolated for so long that he loses the other, but he becomes free and been able to, see the reality of the elements, the natural elements, as the reality. But if he's still back in the society where he is used to, he's always dependent on the other, and that seems to, maybe it has something to do with the other too, that, but here you're saying that it's the individual, and I can't separate, seem to separate the individual from the other, because we are such, nurtured beings. We can't help but depend on the they and the others and so forth.
Right. Yeah. That we're born unfinished. We need to grow into and self-cultivate and be cultivated all at the same time to finish ourselves. But perhaps more than any other animal, we never really are finished. Even in our adult form, we're extremely social animals that need each other to continuously keep finishing ourselves. We're always in need of that help. We are dependent upon culture to an extent no other animal is. I mean, other animals have culture, and you can see it, for example, in the way that old mother or grandmother elephants teach the young over their journeys, all the different tricks about where are the water holes just under the surface that you can't see, or where are the nut trees that only have nuts during certain seasons. There's all these things they need to learn and pass on. And so you could see the culture in action. It's not that they don't have it, but it's that an elephant can be an elephant even without a whole lot of culture, whereas a person cannot be a person without an enormous amount of culture always at work in us. I think it's Marianne, then Phil, then Richard. So go ahead, Marianne.
I've always disliked the original sin, the Garden of Eden. I think St. Augustus is the one who codified it and made it against women. I think it is biased and it has caused a lot of harm. And in Shintoism and Japan culture, they never were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And I think they know how to work with nature a lot better than we do in this culture. The other thing that I'm thinking about when Rick was talking was how funny it is that a lot of people that are Verstand throughout their life, they do all the rules, they work for years and years. Oh, kitty. And then when their bucket list comes up, they want to travel the world, but it's like the world is a treasure. and they see it all and they put it all in that little bag of treasures, but do they really see the world? So that was came in.
Yeah, the Garden of Eden one is interesting because, you know, there's on the one hand there's a lot of value to be drawn out of it, and on the other, you're right. It sort of has inherent in it this idea that the truly valuable place is somewhere else we're not allowed to go to, and you see how different that's kind of a colonizer mindset, because the indigenous mindset, which you can see survivals of in Shintoism, is that this is the Garden of Eden, and we have obligations to live in harmony with it and to learn how it works and serve it and regenerate it and make it richer for future generations. So there's this sort of existentialist versus escapist dichotomy that Kenneth Smith plays with a lot. You can sort of see it in the contrast between the Shintoist and the and let's say the Hebraic Garden of Eden. There's a, you know, one of the things that's fascinating about Shinto is that it seems to be a hybrid religion that has fused I think it's the Yamata people who came to Japan and brought the hierarchies of Shinto, you know, the emperor and the family and the structure, but they laid it on top of an older Jomon culture that had already been there for, as far as we can tell, tens of thousands of years, a very long time. The Jomon had been doing this immersive indigenous thing, and so Shintoism, unlike most modern religions, it preserves a surprising amount of indigenous value system in it. And you can see it with that relationship to nature you're talking about, that sense that we are in the Garden of Eden and we have obligations to it. And anyway, interesting comparison, Marianne. I hadn't thought about that. Phil and then Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment on Robinson Crusoe because I had a completely different reading. He was a Victorian hero because even when he was abandoned, shipwrecked on a desert island, he maintained his loyalty to the tradition because he harvested grain, he kept it, he was counting the weeks of the day, he, you know, all these things, in a sense, built a kind of mini Victorian life in this land, instead of, let's say, wandering in the forest and realizing the beauty of nature and the beauty of the ocean and all that. He actually didn't do that. He was actually very paranoid about that situation. And so he was a hero in that sense because he brought along with him the culture of his tradition, and he wanted to maintain it. And that was the culture, in a way, of colonialism, right? Because we will impose upon this wild nature the values of Victorian England. And so, in a sense, he, because of his refusal to see nature as it was, he had to build a shield around it in order to honor the tradition of the Victorians. So that's a completely different feeling. I wish it had gone the other way, in which he actually said, you know, now I'm in this new environment. It's time to transform myself, you know, and see nature for what it is, rather than to, in a sense, build a wall around it. So a conceptual wall around it. So I just want to bring that out, that actually it was a completely different reading than what we might imagine it to be.
Thank you, Phil. That's interesting. Richard, go ahead.
So I think like so much of the ills that we see in modernity are kind of a refusal to, I mean, we talk about it here, but like to acknowledge and accept that, you know, we are mediated by each other, and by our culture and by our surroundings, but instead we sort of, the modern myth, you know, of like that we're fully autonomous and that our desires are spontaneous and kind of an expression of our authentic, you know, self, whatever that is. Like it's very problematic, I find. And like, you know, like it leads to all this mantra of like, self-sufficiency and lift yourself up by the bootstraps and that type of stuff. But like a number of thinkers that I think like are like, they kind of have this common thread that this thing we've constructed in modernity is really kind of like an anti-myth, and I guess like I'm also kind of thinking of like, when we do see like say when like inmates are placed into long periods of isolation, like that it causes like extreme amounts of psychological damage and regression.
Yes.
Yeah, that like this idea of this sufficient self, like it's
the monad, the Cartesian monad, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't it also true that if a baby isn't held at a certain amount of time, it would die? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, we have to be with each other. We need each other. And of course, this is where some of the sociopathy of the Banausic mindset comes from. We talked earlier today about how the only way to develop Verstand is to insulate yourself from your own emotional live wire connection to the world, and then also necessarily to insulate yourself from other dualic people who are focused on begriff and living a live wire existence, because otherwise they're going to be pushing and pulling you emotionally all the time, and you never get that quiet space it takes to develop the forebrain's focus on ideas and valuing the ideas. The mind won't let you, because it's always going to let the juiciest thing take over. So you got to suppress the juice to keep it quiet enough in there that the intellect and the schematizing logic have a chance to dominate. And so for that reason, the Verstand intellectualist lifestyle involves two things. One is a sort of alienation from life and isolation and withdrawal from life. Also, as Marx talks about when he talks about bourgeois values, he talks about the way that the Banausic lifestyle, which he calls the bourgeois lifestyle, is focused on conventions that don't challenge you emotionally, right? That as long as we all follow the pattern of interactions, I won't upset you, you won't upset me, and we can stay centered in our prefrontal cortex and think things in a rational, abstracted way. What we don't want is you to rock the boat in a way that upsets me, because then I might start to feel some juicy stuff, and it would be harder for me to maintain my Verstand detachment. So you see a lot about the way that isolation and formalization and protocols are layered and layered and layered to create the possibility in modernism for a Banausic lifestyle. It's inevitable accompaniment.
I think the British, like the stiff upper lip is sort of very emblematic of that. And then we're finding actually like our emotions and like our facial expressions, it's not that necessarily that one is unidirectionally leads to the other. They're kind of tied, right?
Yes.
They've actually done research where they forced people to hold a pencil in their mouth to simulate a smile.
Yes.
And then they also ask another group to frown, and it has measurable impacts on their behavior. Just to underline what you're saying, Richard.
Yeah.
When I was traveling, I really felt that the lack of seeing people smile created, with all the masks, created a less civilized society. We looked like automatrons just going through the things. And I felt like I was a package on an Amazon assembly line getting to my destination.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what we went through at the beginning of this session about the way that the sensory and emotional centers are just right next to the physiological centers, and why that's necessary. It makes it logical, understandable. I said logical, haha. It makes it understandable that that the act of smiling would also change your mood. Your body directly affects your feelings, just like your feelings directly affect your body. They're so closely tied to each other, and that's why to live a Banausic lifestyle and to immerse yourself in Verstand requires a lot of distance, a lot of isolation, and a lot of formalization to try to keep your body and keep your emotions in check enough that you can inhabit your forebrain as much as possible. Phil and then Sharon.
Yeah, the way I understand modernism from an art point of view seems completely different from the way you guys are describing it.
Oh, it is. It's a completely different thing.
for me, modernism and art, in the arts in general, probably, but in art, is at a point when civilization was so constrained that they were break glass in case of emergency, right? And which is what they did. Now, the problem is society, as well as the body, has a way to heal itself and close the wound. And that's what it did eventually. It became like late modernism, which became as systematized as the old system in a slightly different way. So I think modernism in that case, it to me is very different. So somehow I hear this parallax between how I understand it.
Yeah.
Break glass in case of emergency
Yeah.
versus like well, the way you guys are describing it, which is like
totally
so
different.
that
Totally
it's like
different.
I had trouble in a sense adjusting like what does that all mean? It is
Exactly.
completely different. Yeah.
Exactly. It's like the two words for bat. You know, one of them you swing to hit a ball and the other one flies around in the air, and they are not the same thing at all, even though they both move through the air, and you can draw more comparisons between them, but the comparisons are only confusing because they're really two different things. So, you know, Kenneth Smith's modernism is part of the modern medieval ancient schema and not part of the schema that anybody else uses for modernism, unless you're looking at the existential philosophers like Arendt and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Hegel and so forth. So yeah, that challenge is so big. There are some people who used to be regular attendees of these calls who left because they were so upset that we would not change the use of the word modernism to match the definition she already had. She'd been coming for months, but finally she said she just couldn't take it anymore. It's just we're doing it wrong. We shouldn't be using the word that way. And this is the thing Kenneth Smith talks about, is the challenge of talking about the fundamental epistemology and axiology of the human condition requires misusing a lot of words, because modernism, the modern world, the modern epoch has worked so hard to make those words mean things that seem to make modernity inevitable and good. That to make it impossible to criticize itself. And so we either end up just coining gibberish words and telling people to memorize them, or we end up challenging the definitions they have and saying, well, we're going to give you a synonym for the words that we're going to give you an alternate definition for that word that can be used sometimes.
Could I bring up another issue that's slightly different, but because
Sure.
of some comments made earlier that
Sure.
I'm raging to want to speak up.
Yeah.
This weekend, I saw a video that was horrifying. We all know industrial fizzing with the net is a destruction of the world. We know
Yes.
that. But this was not as alarming as this video I saw, in which these were line fishing. Let me describe how the video went. You see a boat. There's a line of fishermen all on the side, both sides of the boat. And they're using fishing poles like we normally use. But in front of the boat, there was a guy that was just throwing chum into the water, okay? And obviously they discover through sonar, whatever it is, a school of fish. They throw chum in there.
Yeah.
And these guys were just pulling off fish after fish, just like this, okay?
Yeah.
Like this, like, it was horrible because not only, well, it's less efficient than net fishing on the volume scale, but it was horrible because these people were becoming part of the machine. Mechanically just doing this. Of course, they figure out on a deep level what fish is. You throw chum into a school of fish, they're going to go crazy, going to bite at anything, right?
Yeah.
So then I looked at some, I couldn't see it clearly, but I looked at somebody who finally had to change what I might be called a hook or something else, so that at least a fish would bite, right? And they must have devised a hook in which you could just hook it and fling it. And then when it got to a certain point, you could pull back and they snap and they fall into the ship and just mechanically being done. And I think then the fish go into processing, and the unused part, it comes out and becomes chum, and you could do this over and over again. But what struck me is how human beings, now this is not just the horrible part about the fish, because it's less dangerous than net fishing, but how human being has become mechanized.
Yes.
I mean, like, yes, we see that in mass production, but this was just like incredible, because all the guy did is like,
Yeah.
they were about this fast. Throw the
It's like
thing
a mechanical
in.
part.
I know. Throw the thing in, yank it. There's a fish will they just automatically snap it up. So they've learned to control the fish because they know exactly what they need. Like we control society because we know that human beings are attracted to a kind of synthetic money or whatever. They're gonna chase after it. And then it's like, and then these people are like turned to such a mechanical part, they're no longer really human, at least at that particular product. It's like, wow, this is really abusing not only nature, but abusing humanity.
Yeah.
And they, because I guess they need the money so badly, they don't mind being just a mechanical part. It's like, wow, this is like fantastic. It's like, wow, how did that work? Yeah, and so that was, I guess, the state of efficiency that deny not only the fish existence, but human existence.
That's right.
That's so like shocking.
Wow, that's a metaphor that's going to stick with me. Thank you, Phil. Sharon, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to respond to Mary Ann, and I want to comment on the pandemic. I think the pandemic had positives and negatives. And because being an anesthesiologist, I wore a mask for a significant percentage of my life, I came to understand that people feel emotion through their eyes, and people smile through their eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we had to wear a mask on the outside, it was not very isolating. What I thought, it was challenging you to put more into just being.
Right.
Into just more relating to other human beings. The other thing I think is that modern man is modern because he's drifted farther away from nature. And I don't think we stay in any one state of regret or Banausic or Vernunft. I think we vacillate between those states, depending on the situation and the demands of that situation.
Right.
And I think as modern man, modernism, we've lifted far away from nature. So our acquisition of the wisdom that leads us to a meaningful life is harder and harder. Hence your fishing expedition, Phil.
Yes.
That's an example of it. The disconnect from nature allowed you to do that enjoyably, probably.
Thank you, Sharon. That's potent. James, go ahead.
Yeah, I put in the chat a reference to Michelle Turner's retelling of the Robinson Crusoe story, in which he goes into the the study of human nature, and it kind of like follows what Sharon just saying, that modern man has drifted really way to the extreme of maybe acculturation and away from nature. And so when it comes to the question of what is reality, right? What is really out there is hard to for the person under McGriff or Rashad, is hard to maybe determine, because he's constantly under the sway of the other, the superego, or the they, interpreting what the reality is, because he's so far removed from his own nature. And that Robinson Crusoe story, the retelling of it, perhaps, is a kind of like a study into that story where Robinson Crusoe meets Friday. Friday decides to leave the island, but Robinson Crusoe decides to stay on the island. he's happy on the island by himself. It's like yeah, in the retelling of it, he's describes him as his instincts, his sexuality has been redirected towards the elements, that he identifies with the sky as a bride of the solar. The solar is the groom, and so his whole even his sexuality has been redirected, or perverted, however you want to interpret that, right?
Yeah, that's interesting stuff. I can't remember which writer it is. It might be Kierkegaard. One of the philosophers, and I don't think it is Kierkegaard, I think it's somebody else, wrote at some length about Robinson Crusoe in his diaries, in his journals. And there's a quote, maybe it'll come back to me in a future week, that Kenneth Smith uses a lot about Socrates, that comes out of the discussion of Robinson Crusoe. So this guy, like you're doing, this guy sort of unpacked, and like Phil's doing, unpacked all of these interesting implications of the story and where it took us. So thanks for that. So let's see if we can, in the remaining 22 minutes, kind of pin down a little bit about how Vernunft works, because I've only shown 2 thought balloons here, but the idea of Vernunft is that there's a third thought balloon, and that it's something we can cultivate, and that the capacity to do it was always in us biologically. Just like when we're an infant, we have the capacity for Verstand, even though we aren't doing it yet. And we can grow into it and develop it. And after a while, you'd look at an adult human being and say, it's hard to imagine how you could ever have existed without Verstand. If we knew what Verstand was and we knew how the brain worked, we'd say, wow, I can't imagine what that would be like, until you see an infant and you're like, oh, I get it. There it is. That's Begriff without Verstand. In the same way, there is this third capacity that is even less obvious than Verstand is, but even more necessary. And that can only unfold after Verstand has unfolded, right? The bud, the blossom, and the fruit of Hegel, when he talks about it's the philosophy of the mind, a phenomenology of Geist, he's talking about Begriff to Verstand to Vernunft. He's saying there is this third capacity, and that the third capacity is just as necessary to being a finished human being as Verstand is to being what we consider to be an adult. Now you have to think about that for a second, because that's an extreme claim. Modernism claims that all you need is what you see before you in society, that history's done, that there shouldn't be any more revolutions. We can have metaphorical revolutions or advertising revolutions, but we can't have any actual revolutions because history's done. We've arrived at perfection, or we've arrived at the system that will eventually get to perfection if we're patient enough. And that there's no need to look beyond the scope of what modernism proposes to be the capacity for human beings. But these existentialist philosophers are saying what modernism considers to be the most mature adult form of human being possible is as inferior to and undeveloped compared to an actual fully developed human being as a squalling infant is to a president. That's the difference. And that we can't see it because we don't have any examples of it, because modernism has gotten rid of it. Anybody who has the capacity for Vernunft or shows the inclinations towards Vernunft is rechanneled by, so they're turned around away from Vernunft and back to one of these 2 modes. They can either be douloi or they can be banausoi, but they may not be aristoi. There's no place for them in the modernist schema. And because all of us as human beings have the capacity to fool ourselves, to be deluded. And why I say capacity? I mean, because every day, every minute of the day, we are proficiently and abundantly fooling ourselves and remodeling ourselves. It's very easy to get somebody who could have developed into an Aristos and instead get them to mold themselves into a doulos or a banausos. Now, they may be an unhappy doulos or banausos because there's a part of them that's deeply unfulfilled. The yearning to engage in Vernunft is not going to be fulfilled doing either of those things. But the rest of them has been tied into enough of a knot that whenever they act on their impulses turn them back away from Vernunft and back to Begriff or Verstand. And thus, the system perpetuates itself. The people who primarily would challenge it are turned into accomplices for it. So this drawing's incomplete. This is just a draft. And like, it's not going to be stars eventually, it'll be trees. It's very easy to show the difference between a real tree and an artistic impression of a tree and a diagram of a tree to show the schematizing. But there has to be that third thought balloon. And that third thought balloon, as Hegel says, can only arise from Begriff and Verstand through a reconciliation process that couldn't be done using Begriff and Verstand alone, but depends upon using the actual world for reference to create the third mode of thought. It's actually not a synthesis in the Kantian sense of Begriff and Verstand, because it actually uses the actual world to tone both of them and tame both of them and rework them to serve it. And the result of that is so different from either one of them that you would never mistake it for a balance between them or a compromise between them. It's a third mode of thought. And I'll dig into that in a second. Marianne, go ahead.
Are you saying a fully developed person is, has that presence, like be here now, like Ramdas?
Yeah, they can do both the Begriff things and the Verstand things, which is something that a doulos can't do and a Benausos can't do. A Benausos can imitate a doulos sometimes to a limited extent, but they aren't actually fully immersing themselves because they're also simultaneously ironically detached from themselves as Verstand inhabiting Benausoi. And likewise, a Begriff can model or imitate or mock what they think a Benausos is like. Right? They can pretend to be Einstein, for example, and imitate him, but they don't feel comfortable in that mindset. They don't believe in it, and they're not immersed in it. They've actually separated themselves from themselves to pretend to be something that they're not. And as soon as it's over, they go right back to being what they are. The thing about an Aristos is that they can authentically do both the Begriff things and the Verstand things while not being either a doulos or a Benausos, because unlike those two, they don't restrict themselves to those mindsets. They inhabit those mindsets, but not just one at a time, and they orient them towards something. Both of those mindsets are oriented towards themselves, like a little loop. When you try to reach out from a Begriff mindset, your perceptions and thoughts and actions all loop back upon the frame of reference of your own experience. It's a self-enclosure, but there is a way to cut those loops so that they're not self-enclosed. So that when you reach out from Begriff or when you reach out from Verstand, if you're doing it from an heuristic perspective using Vernunft, it can actually reach out of itself to the actual world, which is something that a doulos can't do with Begriff and a Benausos can't do with Verstand, because they want to self-enclose themselves. So this is a different kind of capacity. If you were an Aristos, so that you could comprehend these differences, and I'm not none of us in modernism can be a healthy Aristos. To be clear, this is not about patting myself on the head or patting Kenneth Smith on the head. We're anything like an Aristos or anything that longs to be an Aristos in the modern order is really only allowed to be one of these things. And so it can yearn and long and attempt to approximate all at once, but it's not allowed to live that way. And as you know, it's practice that makes you good at things. And since we're not allowed to practice it, we're never allowed to get good at it. So we're never allowed to become the thing itself. We're describing based upon the evidence of past epochs, when there was not as sophisticated a characterological genocide to eliminate the third mode of thought. So, but the idea is, and based upon reading and based upon studying it, if you were an Aristos, you could look at an Aristos engaging in Begriff, and you would never confuse it for a doulos engaging in Begriff, because the doulic Begriff is turned back on itself, but the heuristic Begriff reaches outside of itself and orients towards the actual world. And likewise, an Aristos can engage in Verstand, and you would never confuse it with a Benausos engaging in Verstand, Because when the Benausos engages in Verstand, it turns back on itself and tries to explain everything systematically and intellectually. Whereas when an Aristos engages in Verstand, they use it only as a model for reality, for actuality, for the actual world. And they're constantly refusing to let it self-enclose itself. The heuristic Vernunft approach to these basal metabolic capacities of the mind is to uncoil themselves and make them dilate to encompass things greater than themselves, instead of constantly trying to caricature everything outside themselves to make it fit within themselves. Right? To be an idiot, to be self-enclosed in one's own experiences or one's own thoughts, is to insist on warping everything outside of oneself to make it seem to fit inside the limitations of oneself. To do the opposite, to dilate your mind and your character so that it's always growing and always changing and trying to encompass more and more of reality, and not just more details that fit our existing value system, but even revolutionary insights that cause us to have to overhaul our value system and our worldview, and trying to do that on a regular basis. These are the defining fingerprints of Vernunft. Vernunft is critical of itself in a way that Begriff can't be critical of itself, and Verstand can't be critical of itself when they're in the hands of Duloi and Benausoi. Does that make sense? Kind of the sketch that I'm doing so far, I'm comparing and contrasting them, and how you could tell them apart is you sort of kind of conceptually getting this. I can make it a lot more concrete in a moment, which I will do. But before I do, I want to see if you can
Well,
see
conceptually, what I hear you saying is that there's an interplay between these three character states.
Yes.
And the more advanced the Vernunft, he can put, there's a downward interplay between Verstand and Begriff, but it's difficult for those on the base of the triangle, to interplay and be Vernunft. And that, I think, in my mind, is what I see as the road less traveled.
Yes.
Very few people take the road to not full, because you're never fully human integrated, but you attempt to be fully integrated as a human being. I think it's a lifelong struggle and a constant challenge.
Yes.
And you never quite get there, but it is the road less traveled. And I do think we go back and forth between these three states, less and less the more developed we are. That's what I hear you saying. Am I getting it?
You are. Yeah, you're getting it. And the thing about these basal metabolisms of the mind is that you can develop them with less acculturation than it takes to develop Vernunft. We're born Begriff, so it takes no acculturation at all to be able to engage in Begriff activities. But Begriff can't understand itself until it develops Verstand to give it distance from itself, an ability to abstract itself. And so that requires some acculturation. You know, we were talking earlier in this. You might want to check the recording out when this is over, Sharon. So we spent some time looking at the structure of the brain and how that relates to these mindsets in order to make this less abstract and more concrete. So one of the things we talked about is that Verstand takes an enormous amount of work and effort, not just internally and in terms of skills, but even the way you organize your entire life to try to create a mind that's insulated enough to permit Verstand to develop. But even that is nothing compared to how dependent Vernunft is upon acculturation. It's basically nearly impossible to be a Benausos without acculturation. It takes a lot of Verstand development to get that, and a lot of education to get that far. But you can still get farther down that road than you can down the road to Vernunft unless you've got a culture that's helping you. And this is where it's all going to come full circle. And you see that everything that we've been talking about for the last 3 weeks is actually part of the Mythos and Logos discussion, because it takes a Logos culture to really develop Benausoi into the full blossom of Verstand. And it takes a Mythos culture to develop people, to acculturate them into the full fruit of Vernunft. All of these three things are related together in that cycle. And that's why it's so possible to suppress the development of Vernunft and of Aristoi by engineering the culture to prevent that acculturation, because it handicaps Vernunft more than it handicaps the other two. So does this make sense, Sharon? It's talking about what you were saying about nature versus nurture and acculturation and how they affect the three.
Yes.
Thanks for bringing that up. James and then Dave.
Yeah, it sounds like a Hegelian dialectical process of
Oh yeah.
having to you know, rise you know, in this process towards the infinite or the absolute.
Yes.
And you know, kind of like Kierkegaard's you know, talking about the night of faith.
Yes.
You embrace the infinite, because there's, you know, because these two you know, stars, you know, the Duloi and the Benatsoi, are really in the world of the finite, right? They're locked into their ideas of what is true and real.
Yes.
And they got to break out of that, and it's sort of like a dialectical process that leads you out of that cage of you know, ideological thinking.
That's exactly right. That's exactly how Kenneth Smith puts it. And if you reread these essays and watch his use of terms finitizing and infinitizing and synonyms for them, you'll see that what you just said is all over what Kenneth Smith writes. But of course, until we know the schema, we don't know what he means by them, why he's talking about them, how they're relevant. But they're relevant in exactly the way you just described. Dave and then Marianne.
Yeah, it strikes me that the slave master paradigm that you often use, Rick, and I just have to say it's one of the most valuable concepts among many that I've picked up from the course so far. I use it almost daily in my thinking. The relationship between letting something be your servant or letting it be your master is so important. And for Vernunft, you know, you could think of this as a person who allows both Begriff and Verstand to be their servants and disallows either one becoming their master.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, all this terminology, you know, the German terminology that Hegel developed was inspired by the Heraclitean and Aristotelian terminology, and they were a slave society, even though what Athens meant by slavery was so completely different from what moderns mean by industrialized commodity Verstand slavery. It was a completely different thing, despite the use of the same words. Although, to be honest, the Greeks didn't have the word slavery. They had a different word that we translate as slavery. We don't have a word for what they were doing. Which is, in terms of the Athenians, it was more like parenting. In terms of the Spartans, it was closer to what the South did in the US, you know, the kind of commoditizing of human beings. But in neither case was it identical to what moderns do, because the Greeks couldn't conceive of human beings as evacuated of meaning as moderns do. Because for moderns, with the Verstand-oriented world, all the juice has been sucked out. So everything's evacuated of meaning, including other human beings. Which is why our slavery is absolutized in the way that it is. Marianne, go ahead.
I want you to explain something. I'm reading Webs, and I'll read you a sentence. Concrete human intelligence can hardly realize what has been done to it, why it has fallen into fragmentation, factious and incoherent. So what does he mean by concrete human intelligence?
So this is the perfect setup for what I wanted to talk about next. Thank you, Marianne. It couldn't be better. So the idea is that both Begriff and Verstand are necessary faculties for human beings. There's a reason that they come first. They come first because just like the brainstem is more necessary than the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is more necessary than the cerebrum, and that's why they evolved in the order they did. In the same way, Begriff is more necessary than Verstand, and Verstand is more necessary than Vernunft. And yet we're not complete until we reach Vernunft. So Begriff doesn't understand itself or Verstand. Verstand doesn't understand itself or Begriff. Neither of them can see either what they are or what they could be in a different culture that allowed them to uncoil and infinitize to use the terminology I think it was Dave was talking about a moment before. So, you know, in a Banausic civilization, Begriff, you know, is suppressed in the sense it's got capacities that it's not allowed to unfold. Its unfolding is only allowed to go so far. It has to stay within the lines that Verstand has drawn for it. It's allowed to be immediate, but not to break down a lot of separations that Verstand deems necessary to control society. You know, Begriff wants to form wholes. It wants to heal schisms. It wants to create a complete identity of immersion in the self and in one another and in nature. That Verstand can't tolerate because Verstand needs to analyze and separate and leverage and get control over things. So the natural, normal unfolding of Begriff, if it were allowed to continue developing, would develop through Verstand into something else, into Vernunft. And when it developed into Vernunft, it would become something unrecognizable to itself, something far more potent and profound. But because Verstand won't allow it, when in a Banausic civilization like ours, Verstand won't allow it to unfold that far, it never gets to see the fruit that it's ultimately could become, and that it wants to become, and that it's teleologically driven to become, but that it's kept in a prepubescent state from ever becoming. And so it's only in Vernunft, in an eristic personality, that we see the complete unfolding of Begriff and what it could be. And it's the same for Verstand. In a Banausic civilization, we're not even seeing Verstand in its full potential. We're seeing it in an abbreviated potential, a self-enclosed potential that doesn't show its true complete powers. This is where the Greek terms become really useful augments to the German terms, because the German has 3 terms, one for each of these, but in the Greek we only use 2 terms. And the 2 terms are gnosis and noesis, really. And the use of these terms is suggesting that what we see in Begriff is a stunted, immature form of gnosis. It's a basal, naive gnosis. But we won't see gnosis in its full form until we see it in Vernunft, in an eristic personality and culture. A mythos culture unfolds gnosis into its full potential that we see in things like the wisdom sayings of the oracle at Delphi, the profundity of these capsule statements that unfold whole cosmoi of meaning that get us thinking for the rest of our lives, like know thyself, like character is fate. These dense nuggets of meaning that pull together the whole world in ways that illuminate it. These are the products of gnosis, but not gnosis in the naive form we see it in Begriff. It's not capable of it when it's that stunted. Only when it is matured through the blossom into the fruit do we see the full gnosis. And that's what he means there. But what he didn't say, but also means, although it's implied, is that we're also not seeing the full capacity of the analytical mind, because the analytical mind in a Banausic civilization is stunted and self-enclosed. This is noesis, what the Greeks call noesis. What we see in Verstand is a naive form of noesis, a stunted, immature form of noesis. It's merely a blossom. It never becomes a fruit. It's not until it's acculturated in the Aristos and in an eristic mythic culture into the full flowering of Vernunft that noesis and gnosis together are able to bear the fruit that lets us see the amazing power that analytical intellect has when it is not trying to isolate itself from immersive, experiential, synthetic, whole-forming gnosis. Gnosis and noesis together create something radically profound and different from either of them separated. And that's what he's alluding to with that passage. Right. And so this is another way, and I didn't draw a diagram yet of this, but I meant to, of a diagram showing the 2 angles coming up from Begriff in one direction up into Vernunft, and from Verstand in the other direction up into Vernunft, so that they intersect in Vernunft and become something new. It's the child of the 2, the further development of the 2 that we see in Vernunft, in the eristic character and eristic culture and mythos culture. And this is why it's hard to talk about mythos and logos without talking about these things, because what we mean by mythos culture only makes sense once we've traced through the embryological development of the human mind through through Begriff, the naive gnosis of Begriff, into the naive noesis of Verstand, and then into the further stage of development of the sophisticated merger of the two, the full powers of gnosis and noesis together in Vernunft. There is this further stage of maturation that we never see. You guys seen or heard of the science fiction movie Logan's Run? Logan's Run is it's about a supposed paradise in which everybody's beautiful and healthy and happy, and they have everything they want, but everybody has to die at age 30. That's how they keep it that way. They're all killed at age 30 before any of the problems of old age can develop. And so what looks like a paradise or a utopia turns out to be a dystopia, because all of the fruits of wisdom of old age are kept away from the civilization by killing off all the old people. And that is a metaphor for the way that we kill off Vernunft and suppress heuristic personalities and suppress mythos culture and keep ourselves in this naive, immature form of Verstand culture in which only Begriff mentality and Verstand mentality, only Douloi and Benausoi are allowed to exist. No Aristoi, because Aristoi would require us to change everything. Sharon, go ahead. You got your hand up.
So when I think about Vernunft, I think of it as the almost fully integrated human being. So I look at it as being able to have a grasp on reality without the concepts, because you've learned it. So what I want to know is how does the other two states, the Begriff and the Verstand, in their evolution or lack of it, how do they deal with reality versus concepts when it comes to concepts? I don't know if I'm sounding confusing.
No, I know just what you're asking. It makes perfect sense. So the basal metabolism of the mind, to use Kenneth Smith's framing of it, that is the two mentalities that we're born with and that we develop through under modernism, and that we don't get any further than under modernism, whether it's Begriff or Verstand, whether it's the Dulic lifestyle or the Benausic lifestyle. They act like Procrustean beds. What they do is they take in reality, and the only parts they don't distort are the parts that fit comfortably in the worldview that they have. And the parts that don't fit comfortably in the worldview they have, they torture out of shape until they do. Just like Procrustes tortured his guests to fit on his bed. And so the doulos tortures reality to make it fit the doulos's own experience of life so that it's consistent with and does not challenge that worldview. And Verstand does the same thing, but does it in a Verstand way. It abstracts reality into a bunch of facts and suppresses the parts that don't fit within the intellectual and educational mindset that the Verstand brings to bear. Suppresses all those parts of reality and only keeps the abstractions because they fit comfortably within the bed that Verstand has. Vernunft is the only one that takes in perceptions of the world and says, this doesn't fit my bed. I think my bed is wrong. I better rework my bed in light of this new thing until that thing fits on the bed comfortably without any distortion. That's when we talk about the relationship between the self and the other, between the human being and the actual world. Vernunft is the first mentality that says that it's the mind that should change, not the actual world that should change. And we should rework our worldview over and over and over throughout our lives to keep dilating it to encompass more and more of the infinity of reality. When Dave was talking about finite and infinite, this is what he means, that the Dulic mindset and the Benausic mindset are both finitizing in that they've drawn a line and said everything inside this is real and everything outside of it is not real because I don't understand it. And so therefore, anything I ever come to in life, I have to warp it to fit it inside the finite circle that I've drawn. The circle becomes God in the sense that it's unchallengeable and unquestionable. It must be allowed to remain what it is, and it's reality that we're going to warp until it seems to fit inside that circle. But Vernunft is the one that says the circle is the thing that has to change. I have to keep dilating and dilating and changing my worldview over and over to keep growing and being better able to represent the actual world outside of me, because I am not an idiot, says the Aristos. I'm not an Aristos. But the Aristos says, I'm not an idiot. I refuse to be an idiot. Just like the Verstand, the Benausos refuses to be a doulos and holds in contempt a lifestyle in which you can't get out of your own experiences. In the same way, the Vernunft holds in contempt the worldview in which you're not able to get out of your own mind, the worldview in which you keep insisting that what's in your mind is right. The Vernunft mindset is the one that says, of all the things I don't want to do in life, the thing I least want to do is lie to myself about what's true. Because if I lie to myself about what's true, then I'm not going to be able to reach conclusions about meaning that can be relied on. And if I can't reach conclusions about meaning, then I'm not going to get right and wrong correct either. And I'm going to do the wrong things in life, and I'm going to treat people badly. And I can't have that. I won't have it. I will do whatever it takes, no matter how uncomfortable, to morph myself and transform myself over and over so that I can do less and less wrong to others in the world as life goes on. That's the core ethos of the Aristos, the pushing the boulder up the hill, the constantly overhauling your own worldview, because the thing that you can't stand is to be the person you were when you were younger, when you trampled over other people and the world out of ignorance and out of self-enclosure and idiocy. You say, I don't want to be that guy ever again. I don't want to do that ever again. That's my phobia, says the Aristos. That's what I'm struggling against. I think it's Sharon, you've still got your hand up. Did you have another question?
No, sorry.
Okay,
Didn't come
that's
back.
okay. So then I think it's Phil and then James. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, this so much goes back to actually what my art is about. And it goes back in a way to my discussion when I went back to my roommate and says, I discovered the missing link, right? The missing link is in essence mankind, right? Because mankind is actually two beings. One is he's part of mankind, and the other is that he strives to be human. The difference, however, is that maybe it's not a difference. The difference is like my paintings are about fallen angels. Even when you become human, you must be willing to live the life of the tragic and the timeless, because you will never be, you could only become, because you will always be imperfect, right?
Right.
And I think as hard as, not only is it difficult to get there, it's a hard ask to ask somebody to live a life that's tragic and essentially timeless, right? I mean, it's like, it goes against our instincts in a way, right?
Yes.
So in that sense, like, it's difficult, not only in terms of knowledge, but difficult in terms of psychology. So I think it might be because you seem to be satisfied with reaching there, and it's like a state of achievement or arrival, but never really arrive. We will never get there. It's like, are we there yet? No, we're not there yet. It's like, so there is a tragic part within that, because you'll never get there, because you're always maybe trying to get there, but you're always willing to just become an endless becoming. I don't know if that is actually sustainable within human beings, and you have to accept that is the way it's going to be. That you have wings, you want to fly, but you could never really fly. I mean, it's like you're grounded with the idea that you want to fly. And so I agree with what you're saying. I mean, I'm always wondering myself, like, could I live with that situation? Even though I can live with that situation in my art, you know? And most people can. That's why, in a way, my art could never really sell, because, like, who wants to be the fallen angel? I mean, in that sense. So I'm not sure whether your view of what that is encompass the tragic and the timeless, Or
Yes.
does it actually transcend and get there in a way? You say
So what you're describing is the existential condition of an Aristos, right? It is part of what makes the Aristos alien compared to the doulos and the Benausos is that the doulos and Benausos believe that they are self-sufficient. Their way of life is self-sufficient. That's what makes them finitizing. They turn away from the opportunities from growth because it sounds like a lot of work and it would overthrow a lot of what they believe. And it would overthrow what they believe radically, right? I mean, the Verstand lifestyle is so different from the Begriff lifestyle that the Begriff rightly senses that literally everything would be up for question. This is not a finite task to grow out of the Begriff mindset into Verstand. And so they shy away from it. They don't want it. And the Verstand likewise senses, even though they don't understand, that the demands of Aristeia would force them to give up the very thing they spent their entire life building, deliberately investing in a way that the Begriff didn't deliberately cultivate themselves. I mean, we're born into Begriff, but the Verstand worked their, the doulos worked their, the Benausos worked their asses off to enter the Verstand lifestyle. They worked so hard, they organized their lives so much that they are more invested in protecting and preserving those systems than the douloi are in protecting Begriff ways of life. So they are even less likely to want to infinitize by entering the tragic condition of being eternally incomplete and becoming instead of being. The state of believing that you just are and do not have an obligation to become characterizes the two metabolic personalities, the basal metabolic personalities of the mind. But the opposite of that is what characterizes the Aristos, that they know, they have now proven, having lived through two different finitizing mentalities, they know there is no way that a finitizing mentality can ultimately be moral or just or honest, and that they must therefore be incomplete forever and accept that they're incomplete forever, even as they're always struggling to become less incomplete than they are now. There's a reason why tragedy is an art form highly prized by Aristoi and would-be Aristoi, because they see in that the tragedies of their own condition, right? The Greeks believed that stories about douloi and Benausoi were comedies, and stories about Aristoi were tragedies, because the Aristos at least is trying to do better, which makes it tragic when they fall short of their aspirations. But the Benausos and the doulos are only trying to be what they already are. They are finitizing. So they're not really trying to do better. You can't say, wow, it's so tragic that they didn't, do better than that, because they weren't even trying. They were just existing as what they are. And as a result, there was nothing at stake in the way that there is for the heuristic life. The heuristic life has this prize at stake that you're never going to win. And that's tragic. So that's why comedy for them isn't just about laughing. Comedy for them is about the unfortunate but not tragic condition of being a Benausos or a doulos, in contrast to the tragic condition of being an Aristos. So what you're describing, Phil, is like at the core of how the ancient Greeks saw the heuristic condition, that we are striving for something we'll never achieve, that we have a spark of the greatness of the gods, but it's never going to turn into the flower. We're never gonna be able to pat ourselves on the head the way that a Benausos pats themselves on the head, or a doulos pats themselves on the head, because it will always be, as long as we remain in the heuristic struggle, it will always remain clear how far short we fall from the potential that we are born with.
Well, it seems like the first thing you have to accept is that you are finite, and that the finite could never contain the infinite.
That's right.
I mean, it's like, that's it. And as long as you go face up to that, maybe you'll live that life, but it would never be what I could say a totally satisfying life in a sense, right? Because
that's right. You have to learn to take pleasure in the challenge while recognizing that you're never going to cross the finish line. It's just, you're inevitably, at least a loser crosses the finish line after the winner. But the existential condition of being an Aristos is you don't even get to lose. You're just never going to cross the finish line. And so that's why Sisyphus pushes the boulder up the hill, and the Banausoi and Douloi look at that and think he must be in hell. And only the Aristos looks at Sisyphus pushing up the boulder up the hill and says, no, that's the journey that I want, to push it forever as long as I can. If I could do it forever, then I could always get better. But if I live only a mortal life, then the journey is going to be cut short.
Well, when I was in high school, I ran cross country for a year. I was a bad cross country runner. I tried very hard, but I was finishing in the middle of the pack in spite of the fact that I tried very hard. There was a guy who was just terrible. I mean, in a way, I didn't understand why he was in cross country.
Yes.
He always finished out last, and not only last, but way last. Okay.
Yes.
But I always admired him in a strange way. Like, why is this guy persisting?
Yes.
Like, I mean, I would have said, let's try something else. Right.
Yes.
So in a way, like, so on the one hand, it's like, I feel like I couldn't be comfortable with him, but I always admired him for just doing it. It's like,
yes.
wow,
because it's about the journey, Phil.
Right.
It's not about winning. It's about the journey.
I understand that. But there was still something that was very strange in terms of our way of life that, like, yeah, I mean, like I said, he's not even being close to being last is what I'm saying. It's like, well,
That's right. That's right. He's at least doing the race.
Right.
That's right.
Right. Which it's a whole different kind of struggle to be in if you're at least trying. So
that's where wisdom comes from.
True love is unrequited.
That goes back to that discussion, doesn't it?
That's right.
Yes, that's right.
I want to say something though. Again, I'm not picking on you, Phil, but you said, first of all, we have to accept that we are finite. Yes, we are.
Yes.
But I believe that there's an infinite part of us. That's the soul. And so I believe that we are human bodies housing a soul for a period of time. And there are many, many different versions and quibbles with that concept. But that's one of the concepts that I think, yes, we are finite, but infinity comes with us. Is it conscious? Is it unconscious? What it is? I don't know.
There's a Smithian take on that you might find appealing. And that's that what's in us is not infinite, but it's infinitizing. That is, there is a part of us that longs to go beyond the limits of what we are now. And if it were given a chance, it would go to infinity. But that even if it's not given a chance, if it's even only just given a mortal lifetime, within that mortal lifetime, it longs to transcend its finite limits and to infinitize beyond the boundaries that it has. It's less about whether we've achieved infinity and more about whether we have a drive to infinitize, to grow beyond, to become, a yearning to become.
That's right.
That would be the Heraclitean, Smithian way to say what you just said, Sharon.
Unquenchable longing.
And yes, an unquenchable longing, right. And before I call on James, that, which I'm going to do in a second, I just want to point out that before we started these sessions, Phil, right, you didn't have Douloi, Banausoi, Aristoi as terms. You didn't have Begriff and Verstand and Vernunft as terms, Gnosis and Noesis and the relationship that they have, these three epochs of history, the Kenneth Smithian thing, the character types, the mentalities, mythos culture versus logos culture. And yet, despite all of modernity's neutering of all the terminology that you would have needed to be able to clearly, crisply conceptualize these things, nevertheless, in your life, you built your entire art around this notion of the imperfect striving and yearning for infinitizing. That is the Vernunft impulse, the heuristic impulse, despite everything that modernity could do to make it unthinkable to you, arose anyway in opposition to all that pruning and all that inhibiting. And this is where we get at one of Kenneth Smith's core arguments, that this threefold mentality structure is not a Kantian imposition upon human nature. He is not claiming that people are that way because it would make for a tidy system. What he's saying is that he and Hegel and Kierkegaard and Marx and Kafka and Nietzsche and Hegel and Heraclitus and Aristotle and others have noticed that people come in different flavors with different kinds of longings in them, and that those longings are irrepressible, and that no matter what scorched earth tactics you do to try to create a dystopian civilization in which everybody is molded into preordained shapes, like the plant that pushes its way up through the asphalt and cement, there's something in us lawful and natural that will yearn to unfold in these directions. And all you have to do is look around and you'll see the Begriff in us and the Verstand in us and the Vernunft in us, the Gnosis and Noesis striving in us to express themselves and unfold themselves, even against all opposition. These parts of us are not artifices, and they're not models. There's something that's actually naturally in us that we're attempting to learn how to talk about and to describe, despite the fact that a modern civilization doesn't want us to. It doesn't want us to see the world that way. Because if we fully accept that human nature works the way that it seems to work, we would have to change human civilization to help it and to be compatible with it, rather than what we do now, which is to try to, stamp it out and get it to stay inside the lines. So I'm using you as an example because there's that piece of art hanging right behind you, and you just described it. And what you described is the way that in your life, without any of the Kenneth Smithian framework, you're still carrying out that impulse within you that is within anybody who longs for Aristeia, even if they're not allowed to ever achieve it. James, you got your hand up.
Yeah, this is very timely because there's a discussion coming up called has existentialism harmed our effort to find meaning in an imperfect world? And it takes this point that Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Sartre and Camus, these guys, they maybe set the standards for finding meaning too high.
Yes.
And so why should we even try to experience the frustration of trying to achieve that kind of goal of like you're talking the arrest of, right? That kind of meaning for that kind of trying to be the knight of the infinite, the knight of is just too hard to do, and so you need to settle on the kind of easy kinds of meaning that you can achieve, which is maybe that of the douloi and the venatoi, right? So
yeah, that's right.
So it's based on this book the guy wrote, Landau. That
if you could put that in the chat, I would love to follow up and do some reading.
Yeah. So it's called I'll put that in chat.
That would be great.
I say something.
Please.
I think that if it's not hard, it's not worth doing, because the harder it is, the better your growth. If it's easy, and easy and hard depends on your perception actually, but the more difficult the task, the greater your growth, the greater your sense of self-satisfaction. And so trying to become fulfill an integrated human being is hard. That's why it's called the road less traveled.
Yes.
Right. And I read a book on that. It's by M. Scott Peck. When in my very early adulthood, in fact, just when I was getting divorced and I thought this was a catastrophe, I had to find a way out of it. So the road less traveled was a path to becoming, starting my journey to become an integrated human being, loving, forgiving, understanding, all those things. So if it's easy, I'm not on board. If it's hard, I'm ready to take a shot at it.
Yeah, I think Kierkegaard would approve of you, right?
I don't
that's the
know.
classic.
You see, I can't express myself in those philosophical terms, but I think I understand the basics of it.
Well, the Kierkegaard quote goes like this. He says, as I was growing up, I was looking around myself and seeing all these people who were working to make life easier. And that was how they were serving humanity. And I thought to myself, well, if they're all doing that, what can I contribute? And it took him a while. And eventually he realized, I know what I could do. I could make things harder. And at first you think, well, that's just hilarious. But then you realize that what he's saying is there are very important things in life that can only be achieved by working hard for them. And,
Correct.
finding those difficult roads and mapping those out is a contribution to humanity every bit as much as making things easy is, and maybe more so. I on a personal level, I have a similar reaction to you and Kierkegaard. Part of my thought is, 7 billion people on Earth. What do we need me for? What's why should I be here at all? And the answer, starts out with, well, there's no point in my doing what everybody else can do because they're already doing it. They don't need me for that. What could I contribute that somebody would actually need me for? And the conclusion that one reaches is, well, I should find something hard that's necessary, that I could do that thing and then help other people to do it too. And that way, the thing that isn't getting done, but that needs to get done, could be added to the realm of work that we're doing as a civilization. So like you and Kierkegaard, that's my reaction is, yeah, I want to find the hard thing that I could help with.
Well,
That's
you
the
could
guy
also-
Especially
coming
the part that
last
needs to get. Oh, sorry.
That's the
You
guy
could
coming
also-
last in the race, Phil. That's
The
the
guy
hard
last in the
part.
race.
Yeah, right. No, you could also argue that is the human condition because our ancient, prehistory ancestor had to work hard to just stay alive, right?
Yes.
Now civilization presumably has made it easier for us to be alive. We ought to spend the excess time working hard like they did
Yes.
so that we could become as they are trying to just be. So so there is a kind of moral imperative that we owe to our ancestors in that sense. Our very ancient ancestors, because if they weren't working hard, we would not be.
Yes.
Because they would be dead.
Yes.
Joseph.
And I think that really the important key that you just mentioned, Rick, was the idea of needing what needs to be done, because there has to be a level of service within that. So it's not only that to me is where the most important part about it is being a human, is that not only that you're doing something unique, but you're doing something that needs to be done for others. Otherwise, then you're not fully integrated.
Right.
You're just following your instinctual, way of being.
Yeah.
That's why I was late today.
Well, there we go. So where we are and where we're going next.
Correct.
We're one more away from being able to come back to the text of Mythos and Logos. We're still missing one more thing, but we're almost there.
It's cool. I like today. I really did. I like
Did you?
the images were fantastic. I really appreciate those. Thank you.
My
Hey,
pleasure.
I have a lot of notes today.
Isn't that a contradiction that you promise one more day and we'll be there? We're not supposed to ever get there.
You're going to learn this about me. You're going to learn this about me. All the people I teach at work, they laugh about this. They say, there's a game called Pull My String. And it's, if I was a toy, you could pull the string and I would say something, and I had 3 random things I might say when you pull my string. What are the 3 things that you'd say? And you do this with your friends to say, well, what are the 3 things so-and-so would say? And everybody at work says, one of the 3 things that Rick says when you pull his string is, okay, there's 3 things. No, wait, there's 4 things. Okay, there's 4 things no, wait, there's 5. This is my thing, right? This is what I say when you pull my string. So I think we could do it in one more. I didn't realize until I was prepping for today that we had to spend some time on the structure of the brain in order to cement down how concrete what Kenneth Smith and Hegel and others are talking about is, that it's not a schema. It's something we discover in the nature of human character, and that we're trying to add words for, and that if you think about it, it's shocking that there should be so little language to clearly say these things. It cannot be an accident that we're so incompetent to say the most fundamental things about the structure of human character. It could only be engineered. and a consequence of convergence and evolution. So I thought we better spend some time on that. And I wanted to describe Vernunft in terms of Verstand and Begriff to start with, because we spent so much time making them crystal clear. I thought it would be helpful to do the comparison and contrast. But the real power to understanding Vernunft and to understanding what an Aristos is, and therefore the payoff, what's mythos culture, comes when we look at the structure of reality. Because that's what Vernunft is harnessed to. That's how it escapes the either or trap of Begriff and Verstand, is that it harnesses them to reality. But that's much harder said than it is done. So it's harnessing them to a particular part of reality, and it's got a particular way of doing that.
That was my question.
Next week, we'll talk about archai. And archai is a word that you're going to see crop up over and over in different, both explicit and implicit forms in his essays. He's going to talk about archai, arche, archetypes. He's going to talk about principles and axioms. He's going to talk about world powers. And he's going to use all these different words because English has no word for this, even though Greek had lots of words for it. The idea is that in the cosmos, there are fountains of order that pour forth magnetic patterns that organize the cosmos. And one of the characteristics of these fountains of order is that they're not adding parts. They're adding organization that affects everything. If it doesn't affect everything, it isn't an arche, right? It's one of the signs. So like, remember how we talked about in the brain, if you touch any one neuron, it lights up all the other neurons. It lights them up in 3 dimensions, right? From front to back through the lobes, from side to side through the hemispheres, and from outside to inside through the cortical layers. In the same way, archai are distinguished from any other part of nature in that once you see them, you realize that they are shaping literally everything else. And that there's multiple archai shaping it from different directions. And the conflict between these archai, their interactions, as Heraclitus said, is what produces all the phenomena of the cosmos: trees, rocks, the sky, gravity, you name it. They come
Is that
from,
like a tapestry?
yeah, in the sense that they're all woven through each other.
Yeah.
Each one of them, you know, we can talk about the dimensions of space and time and say that there's just 4 of them. But if we talk about meaning and structure in the cosmos, there is a large number of them, and each dimension is one of these archai. So we'll talk about what they are next time. And we'll talk about how you go about finding out what they are, how you talk about describing them, and why, once you see their nature, you understand why mythos culture is the only possible solution if you want to make archai the centerpiece for how you organize truth and meaning in a civilization. Why mythos cultures existed. That's what we're going to talk about.
Okay. So
Sounds good.
next week, I'm going to be late again,
Okay.
but save the juicy parts for me. I'm coming. I'm not
Yeah.
missing it.
Yeah, and the recordings will be on YouTube, just like this one. You can watch the part you missed on YouTube once David posts it.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Okay. Have a great week.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
Take
very
care,
much.
all.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone. See
Next
you
week.
next week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.